Silver Creek Valley, Montana Territory, April 1876. The first light of dawn broke over Silver Creek Valley, painting the frost-kissed grasslands in hues of amber and gold. Nathaniel Nate Caldwell, a man carved from the unyielding stone of Montana's rugged frontier, rode the northern fence line of his sprawling 20,000-acre Caldwell Ranch. At 47, his face bore the deep lines of a life weathered by brutal winters, scorching summers, and a grief that clung to him like the morning mist. His steel-gray eyes, sharp as a hawk's, scanned the horizon, missing nothing, not the distant silhouette of the Bitterroot Mountains, nor the faint tracks of a coyote that had dared to skirt his property line. The ranch was more than land. It was a fortress of order, a testament to Nate's iron will in a territory that devoured the weak and rewarded only the relentless. His mare, a chestnut beauty named Daisy, snorted softly, her breath forming clouds in the crisp air as they crested a ridge overlooking the valley. From this vantage point, the Caldwell Ranch unfolded like a painting. The sturdy two-story ranch house of timber and river stone stood defiant against the wilderness, its chimney sending lazy curls of smoke into the sky. Beyond it, the barns bustled with the morning's work, 3 ranch hands mucking stalls, the clang of a hammer as someone repaired a loose board, and the lowing of cattle being herded for the day's rotation. It was a scene of disciplined harmony, every element moving in lockstep with Nate's meticulous routine. He allowed himself a single nod of approval, the closest he came to satisfaction, before murmuring to Daisy, "All right, girl, let's get home before Clara starts raising Cain." The sun was just kissing the eastern peaks as Nate guided Daisy down the trail toward the ranch house. His thigh ached, a souvenir from a Confederate bullet during the war, a pain that flared in the cold, but he dismounted with the practiced ease of a man who'd spent half his life in the saddle. "Morning, Mr. Caldwell," called Tommy Weaver, a lanky 19-year-old ranch hand hauling water to the horse trough. "Jim says we oughta move the south herd today. Storm's brewing out west." Nate gave a curt nod, his response as spare as the Montana skyline. "Tell Jim to hold off till I check the sky. Don't want the boys caught in a squall." His interactions with the hands were always thus, brief, professional, stripped of warmth. They respected him, perhaps feared him, but none could claim to know the man behind the iron facade. Inside the ranch house, the air was thick with the scent of brewing coffee and sizzling bacon, a comforting contrast to the chill outside. Clara Bennett, a widow of 62 with a spine of steel and a heart she kept carefully guarded, presided over the kitchen like a general over a battlefield. She'd managed Nate's household for 7 years, her sharp tongue and sharper efficiency the only things keeping the place from descending into bachelor chaos. "You're late," she said without looking up from the stove, flipping a pancake with a flick of her wrist. "Food's getting cold, and I ain't reheating it." Nate hung his coat and hat on the peg by the door, placed his Winchester in the rack with the care of a priest handling a relic, and took his seat at the head of the oak dining table. "Storm's coming," he said, pouring coffee from the pot Clara had set out. "Tell Jim to keep the men near the barns. Don't want anyone stranded if it hits hard." Clara nodded, jotting a note in the small ledger she kept in her apron pocket, her system as precise as Nate's own. The dining room, like the rest of the house, was a study in preserved time. A girl's coat, too small for any grown woman, hung by the door, its buttons dulled by years of dust. A row of hand-carved wooden animals, bears, horses, a lopsided elk, lined the mantel, untouched despite Clara's relentless cleaning. Above the fireplace hung a portrait, a younger Nate, his face unlined by loss, standing beside a woman with warm hazel eyes and a girl of 10, her grin gap-toothed and fearless. Laura and Emily Caldwell, gone 7 years now, taken in a raid that had shattered Nate's world and left him a ghost in his own life. Clara set a plate before him, 3 eggs, 4 strips of bacon, 2 biscuits, arranged with the same exactitude as every morning since she'd taken over the kitchen. "Sheriff Harper swung by yesterday while you were out," she said, refilling his coffee. "Said there was trouble on the Bozeman Trail. Wagon train got hit, maybe 20 miles east." Nate grunted, his fork pausing only briefly. "Not our concern. The Montana Territory was a crucible of danger, Blackfoot raids, outlaw ambushes, blizzards that buried men alive. Only fools chased dreams out here, and fools paid the price." Clara's lips pressed into a thin line, her disapproval as loud as a church bell. "Women and children, Nate. Harper said the army stretched thin. 7 years ago, such news would have sent Nate riding out with a posse, rifle in hand, determined to help. But that was before the raid, before the Blackwell gang had burned his heart to ash. Army'll handle it," he said flatly, rising from the table. "I'm checking the north pasture. Have Jim meet me there at noon." He was halfway to the door when the sound of hoofbeats cut through the morning quiet, urgent, unfamiliar, not the rhythm of his own men. Visitors to Caldwell Ranch were rare as a blue moon, and seldom bearers of good tidings. Nate's hand drifted to the Colt at his hip, an instinct honed by years of war and loss. Through the window, he saw Sheriff Amos Harper and his deputy, young Caleb Monroe, riding up the path, leading a third horse with a small figure slumped in the saddle. Nate's jaw tightened. Whatever Harper was bringing, it spelled trouble, and Nate Caldwell had spent 7 years purging trouble from his life. "Clara," he called, his voice betraying nothing, "we've got company. Get the guest room ready." A haven disrupted, the girl at Caldwell Ranch. Silver Creek Valley, Montana Territory, April 1876. The hoofbeats grew louder, a staccato drumroll against the hard-packed earth of the Caldwell Ranch's main path, shattering the morning's fragile calm. Nathaniel Nate Caldwell stood at the window, his calloused hand resting on the worn grip of his Colt revolver, his steel-gray eyes narrowing as 3 horses came into view. Sheriff Amos Harper, a grizzled lawman whose weathered face carried the weight of 20 years in Silver Creek Valley, rode at the lead. Beside him was his deputy, Caleb Monroe, a lanky 22-year-old with a nervous energy that betrayed his inexperience. But it was the third horse, a swaybacked gelding led by Caleb, that drew Nate's attention. Slumped in its saddle was a small figure, cloaked in a tattered blanket, head bowed as if the weight of the world pressed upon it. "Clara," Nate repeated, his voice low and steady, "guest room." Now, Clara Bennett, the iron-willed widow who'd kept Caldwell Ranch running like a well-oiled steam engine for 7 years, didn't hesitate. She brushed flour from her hands, her sharp blue eyes flickering with curiosity, and disappeared upstairs, her footsteps echoing with purpose. Nate stepped onto the porch, the chill of the Montana morning biting through his flannel shirt. The ranch hands, Tommy Weaver and 2 others, paused their chores, sensing the shift in the air. Even the cattle in the distant corral seemed to hush, as if the valley itself held its breath. Sheriff Harper reined in his horse a respectful distance from the porch, his broad-brimmed hat casting a shadow over his craggy features. "Nate," he greeted, his voice rough as gravel but warm with the familiarity of old comrades. He and Nate had fought side by side in the war, back when they were young and foolish enough to believe in glory. Didn't mean to ride up unannounced, but this couldn't wait. He gestured to the small figure, who hadn't stirred. "Got a situation." Nate's gaze flicked to the girl, her face hidden beneath a tangle of dark hair matted with dirt and what looked like dried blood. Her clothes, a torn dress and a man's oversized coat, hung loosely on her slight frame, stained with the grim evidence of violence. "What kind of situation?" Nate asked, his tone clipped, already bracing for complications. He'd spent 7 years building a life free of entanglements, a fortress of routine to keep the chaos of his past at bay. Whatever Harper was dragging to his doorstep, it threatened to crack that foundation. Harper dismounted, his boots crunching on the gravel as he approached. Caleb stayed with the girl, gently steadying her horse, his youthful face tight with concern. "Wagon train got hit on the Bozeman Trail," Harper said, keeping his voice low. "Renegade Blackfoot, far as we can tell. Army patrol found the wreckage yesterday morning, 20 miles east, near Willow Bend. 17 bodies, Nate. Scalped, mutilated, the works." He paused, his eyes searching Nate's for a reaction. This little one was the only survivor. Found her hidden under a false floor in one of the wagons, half dead from shock. A cold, unwelcome weight settled in Nate's chest, a ghost of the grief that had haunted him since the Blackwell gang's raid 7 years ago. He forced his expression to remain impassive, but the girl's slumped posture, her silence, stirred memories he'd buried deep, his own reflection in the weeks after finding Laura and Emily's bodies in the creek bed. "Take her to Fort Benton," he said, turning away, his voice harder than he intended. "Or to Promise Creek. Reverend Mitchell's wife takes in strays." Harper sighed, pushing back his hat to reveal a forehead lined with worry. "Tried the fort already. Army doc says she hasn't spoken a word, won't eat, barely sleeps. Just stares like she's seeing ghosts. Reverend's wife has her hands full, with 6 orphans from last winter's fever. Ain't nowhere else, Nate." He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "You've got the space, the means, and, God help me, you know what she's going through better than anyone in this territory." The mention of Nate's loss was a blade, sharp and precise, cutting through the walls he'd built. "Don't you dare bring Laura and Emily into this," he snapped, a rare crack in his controlled facade. His hand tightened on the Colt, not from threat but from the need to anchor himself against the rising tide of memory. Harper held his gaze, unflinching, the way only a man who'd seen you bleed could. "I ain't trying to use them against you, Nate. I'm asking for help. For her." Before Nate could respond, Clara appeared in the doorway, her apron smoothed and her expression softening as she spotted the girl. "Oh, sweet heaven," she murmured, moving past Nate with a speed that belied her 62 years. "Poor lamb, come inside. We'll get you cleaned up and fed." The girl didn't react, didn't even seem to notice Clara's presence until the older woman reached for her arm. Then, with a sudden, animal-like flinch, she jerked away, a small, keening sound escaping her lips, the first sign she was more than a hollow shell. "She's been like that since we found her," Caleb explained, his voice heavy with pity. "Doc Winters gave her something to sleep last night, but she woke up screaming. Took 2 nurses to calm her down." Clara knelt slowly, her movements deliberate, like approaching a spooked colt. "My name's Clara Bennett, child. This is Caldwell Ranch. You're safe here, I promise." For the first time, a flicker of awareness passed through the girl's vacant eyes. She looked at Clara, then at the sturdy ranch house, and finally at Nate, her gaze locking onto his with an intensity that felt like a physical weight. In her eyes, he saw a mirror of his own grief, a silent scream that echoed the one he'd carried for 7 years. "What's her name?" Clara asked, rising but keeping her eyes on the girl. Harper shook his head. "Don't know. Like I said, she ain't spoken. Army found a journal in the wagon she was hidden in. Belonged to a James and Mary Thornton, traveling from Illinois with their daughter, Abigail. We're assuming that's her but can't be sure." "Abigail," Clara repeated softly, testing the name like a prayer. "That's a fine name, ain't it, child?" The girl, Abigail, if that was her name, showed no reaction, her eyes still fixed on Nate, as if searching for something only he could provide. Nate felt trapped by that gaze, cornered by the weight of her unspoken need. He wanted no part of this, had no room in his life for a child's pain when he could barely carry his own. Yet the words came unbidden, rough and reluctant. "One night," he said, breaking the silence. "She stays one night. Then you take her to Promise Creek or send word to the fort to make arrangements." He turned toward the stables, ignoring Clara's disapproving frown and Harper's knowing nod, determined to escape the pull of the girl's haunted eyes. The storm hit Silver Creek Valley just after sundown, a howling beast of wind and ice that shook the ranch house's sturdy timbers and rattled the windows like a warning from the heavens. Nate sat in his study, a sanctuary of polished oak and leather-bound ledgers, a glass of bourbon untouched on the desk before him. The fire in the hearth cast flickering shadows across the room, illuminating the maps on the walls, charts of his land, his empire, his refuge. But tonight, the familiar solitude felt invaded, pierced by the soft, unfamiliar sounds of a child in his home. Clara had spent the afternoon coaxing Abigail to eat, to bathe, to show any sign that her spirit hadn't been snuffed out by whatever horrors she'd witnessed. Her efforts had yielded little, a few sips of broth, a reluctant change into a clean nightgown that Nate recognized with a jolt as one of Emily's, preserved like a sacred relic in the cedar chest upstairs. The sight of it on the stranger's body sent a surge of irrational anger through him, a violation of the sacred space he'd kept frozen in time. The girl's presence had already caused ripples. When Jim Donovan, the ranch's towering foreman, had come to report on the cattle, his bearded face and booming voice had triggered a reaction no one expected. Abigail had recoiled, her small body pressing against the kitchen wall, hands raised as if to ward off a blow. "It's the beard," Clara had explained later, after Jim retreated, red-faced with apologies. "Harper said some of the attackers had heavy beards. Poor thing likely thinks every whisker's a threat." Now, as the storm raged outside, Nate heard footsteps in the hallway, light, hesitant, not Clara's familiar tread. He rose, his hand instinctively checking the Colt at his hip, just as the study door creaked open. Abigail stood in the doorway, her slight figure haloed by the firelight, Emily's nightgown hanging loosely on her frame. Her dark hair, now clean, fell in waves over her shoulders, and her eyes, those piercing, haunted eyes, swept the room, taking in the bookshelves, the maps, the worn leather chair by the fire. A deafening crack of thunder shook the house, and she moved with startling speed, darting to the farthest corner and pressing her back against the wall, her gaze darting to every possible entrance. Nate recognized the instinct, not just fear of the storm, but the desperate search for a defensible position, a survival tactic he'd lived by in the months after the raid. "It's just thunder," he said, keeping his distance, his voice softer than he'd intended. "You're safe in here." The words felt hollow, a promise he had no right to make. He hadn't kept his own family safe. What could he offer this child? Abigail slid to the floor, knees pulled tight to her chest, watching him with a gaze that was both terrified and evaluating, as if measuring his worth. Nate sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "Clara put you in the guest room," he said, hoping to steer her back to bed. A slight nod, the first direct response she'd given, surprised him. "Safest room in the house," he found himself adding, filling the silence. Thick walls, small window too high for anyone to climb through, solid oak door with a good lock. He was describing a fortress, not a bedroom, but the girl's grip on her knees loosened slightly, her shoulders relaxing a fraction. Another crash of thunder, and her eyes squeezed shut, her body tensing again. Without thinking, Nate crossed to the bookshelf and pulled down a worn copy of the Swiss Family Robinson, its spine cracked from years of use. "My daughter," he stopped, clearing his throat, the word daughter a shard of glass in his chest. "I used to read this to Emily during storms. Drowns out the noise." He opened the book, flipping to a familiar passage, and began to read in his deep, steady voice. "The storm raged on, but in our treehouse we were safe, our family bound by love and ingenuity." The words felt foreign at first, rusty from disuse, but as he read, Abigail's rigid posture eased. Her eyes, though still fixed on him, softened, the terror giving way to curiosity. The story, with its tale of survival and hope, seemed to weave a fragile thread between them, a momentary bridge across the chasm of their separate griefs. When Clara appeared in the doorway half an hour later, she froze, her sharp eyes widening at the sight. Nate Caldwell, the man who'd barely spoken a full sentence in years, reading aloud from his daughter's favorite book, while the traumatized girl sat wrapped in a quilt, her eyelids heavy with the promise of sleep. "I've got a tray for her," Clara said softly, setting down a bowl of broth and a slice of cornbread. "Needs to eat something to keep her strength." Nate closed the book, suddenly self-conscious, the spell broken. "Good," he said gruffly. "She needs it." Abigail's expression shuddered at Clara's voice, the vacant look returning as she pulled the quilt tighter around herself. "Come on, child," Clara coaxed, her tone gentle but firm. "Just a few spoonfuls." The girl didn't move, her eyes locked on Nate, as if he were the only anchor in a storm-tossed sea. Nate felt the weight of that trust, heavy as a millstone. He wanted no part of it, had spent years ensuring no one relied on him for anything beyond the ranch's operations. Yet he heard himself say, "Bring the tray in here, Clara." "She can eat by the fire." Clara's eyebrows shot up, but she nodded and fetched the tray, her movements brisk to hide her surprise. "This changes nothing," Nate told Abigail once they were alone again, his voice firm. "Tomorrow you go to Promise Creek. Reverend Mitchell and his wife are good folks. They'll find you a proper home." The girl's expression didn't change, but she shook her head once, a definitive gesture that spoke louder than words. She had no intention of leaving. When Clara returned with the tray, Abigail accepted the broth without protest, eating slowly, mechanically, her eyes never straying from Nate as he paced before the fire. "We'll need to tell Harper if there's kin to contact," Clara said, watching the girl with a mix of concern and practicality. "If she was traveling from Illinois, they're likely a ways off." Nate grunted, his mind snagged on the sight of Abigail in Emily's nightgown, eating from one of their family bowls. It was like a ghost had slipped into his carefully ordered world, stirring memories he'd fought to keep buried. "Harper said they found a journal," he said abruptly. "Did he leave it?" Clara nodded. "In the kitchen. Didn't feel right reading it without permission." "Bring it here," Nate said, catching himself too late as he added, "If we're to help her, we need to know who she is." The "we" slipped out unbidden, a sign he was already entangled in a way he hadn't intended. Clara returned with a small leather-bound book, its pages stained but legible. Abigail's eyes widened at the sight, and she set down her bowl, reaching for it with a sudden, desperate urgency. Clara handed it to her, and the girl clutched it to her chest, rocking slightly, as if it were the last tether to her lost world. "Yours?" Nate asked quietly. Abigail shook her head, then nodded, a complicated gesture that suggested both possession and dispossession. "Her mother's maybe," Clara suggested, holding out her hand. "May I?" After a moment's hesitation, Abigail surrendered the journal, her fingers lingering as if parting with it cost her something vital. Clara opened it carefully, her voice soft as she read, "Property of Mary Elizabeth Thornton." Journey began April 10, 1876, from Springfield, Illinois to Montana Territory. She turned a few pages, scanning the neat handwriting. It's a travel log, weather, landmarks, folks they met. Daily entries, like she was keeping a record for someone. Abigail watched intently, her face showing the first glimmers of emotion beyond fear, a yearning, a desperate connection to the words from her mother's hand. "Here's something," Clara said, pausing at a page near the middle. Abigail turned 13 today. James carved her a little wooden sparrow, named it Jasper after her granddaddy. She says, Clara's voice caught, her eyes meeting Abigail's with sudden understanding. She says she's gonna start her own journal when they reach Montana to write about their new life. Abigail began to tremble, silent tears tracing paths down her pale cheeks. According to Harper, it was the first time she'd cried since being found, a release of the grief she'd held like a dam against a flood. Nate felt something crack in the fortress he'd built around his heart. The girl's silent sorrow was too familiar, a mirror of the pain he'd buried under years of routine and isolation. "That's enough for tonight," he said roughly, rising to his feet. "She needs rest," Clara nodded, closing the journal with care. "I'll sit with her till she sleeps." "No," Nate said, surprising himself as much as Clara. "I'll do it. You've been up since dawn, and tomorrow will be a bear with the storm damage." Clara studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "As you wish, Nate." Her tray's on the sideboard. Try to get her to finish the broth. After Clara left, Nate stood awkwardly in the center of his study, unsure how to proceed. Abigail had stopped crying, but her eyes remained bright with unshed tears, her small body rigid with contained emotion. "You should finish eatin'," he said finally, gesturing to the tray. "Then sleep. Tomorrow's common fast." Abigail made no move toward the broth. Instead, she pointed to the book Nate had set aside, her meaning clear. "You want me to keep readin'?" he asked, surprised. A nod, small but unmistakable. Nate hesitated, then picked up the Swiss Family Robinson again. A few more pages, then bed. As he resumed reading, the girl's tension eased, her small frame relaxing with each word. By the time the storm had moved eastward, leaving only a gentle rain tapping against the windows, Abigail's eyes had drifted closed, her head resting against the arm of the chair. Nate set the book aside, studying her face in the firelight. The resemblance to Emily that had so unsettled him earlier was less pronounced now. This girl was taller, thinner, with a scattering of freckles across her nose that his daughter had never had. Her hair, now clean, was a lighter brown, not Emily's jet-black curls. "You ain't her," he whispered, as much to himself as to the sleeping child. "And I ain't the man to help you." Yet, as he lifted her slight form and carried her to the guest room, a space untouched for 7 years, Nate couldn't shake the feeling that something long dormant within him was stirring, like the first green shoots of spring breaking through a crust of winter snow. Dawn broke over Silver Creek Valley with a clarity that only followed a tempest's wrath. The sky, a brilliant canvas of gold and rose, untouched by the chaos of the previous night's storm. Nathaniel Nate Caldwell stood on the porch of Caldwell Ranch, his calloused hands wrapped around a tin mug of Clara Bennett's black as tar coffee, his steel-gray eyes surveying the damage wrought by the gale. A section of the corral fence lay splintered. Shingles from the stable roof littered the yard like fallen leaves, and the creek that wound through his 20,000 acres had swollen to a roaring torrent, its banks muddy and treacherous. The air carried the sharp scent of wet pine and churned earth, a reminder of nature's indifference to the order Nate had fought so hard to impose. He'd been up since 4, sleep eluding him as the weight of decisions pressed heavier than the storm's winds. The girl, Abigail Thornton, if the journal was to be believed, lay upstairs in the guest room, her presence a crack in the fortress of his solitude. 7 years ago, Nate had vowed never to let another soul depend on him, not after failing Laura and Emily. Yet here he was, tethered to a child whose haunted eyes mirrored his own, her silent grief a challenge he wasn't sure he could meet. Clara emerged from the house, her apron crisp despite the early hour, a second mug of coffee in hand. "Bridge to Promise Creek's washed out," she announced, her voice matter-of-fact but laced with a satisfaction Nate didn't miss. "Jim says it'll be 3 days, maybe a week, before it's passable." Nate's jaw tightened, though he accepted the coffee without comment. The bridge's collapse meant Abigail would remain at Caldwell Ranch longer than his promised one night, a complication he'd hoped to avoid. Clara's expression, sharp as a butcher's knife, told him she considered this a divine intervention. "How's the girl?" he asked, his tone gruff to mask the unease her presence stirred. "Still sleepin'," Clara replied, folding her arms. "Poor thing was wrung out like a dish rag. I laid out some of Emily's old clothes, might be a tad small, but they'll do till we can get to town." Nate's gaze hardened at the mention of his daughter's things, a pang of violation cutting through him. Clara met his glare with steady defiance. "Would you rather she wears that blood-stained rag she came in, or parade around in her nightgown?" Before Nate could retort, Jim Donovan, the ranch's foreman, approached from the stables, his broad shoulders hunched against the morning chill. He removed his hat, revealing dark hair streaked with premature gray, a testament to the hard years he'd spent keeping Caldwell Ranch afloat. "Mornin', boss," Jim said, his voice a low rumble. "Got trouble with the South herd. Lightning spooked em bad, scattered halfway to McAllister's spread. Tommy and the boys are roundin' em up, but we're short-handed with Billy laid up with that busted arm." Nate drained his coffee, the bitter heat grounding him. "I'll ride out. Have Sammy saddle Daisy." Jim hesitated, glancing toward the house. Sheriff Harper stopped by the bunkhouse at first light. "Checkin' on the girl. Said he's sendin' word to Fort Benton, but the storm hit him hard too. Might be a few days before the army can send anyone." Nate handed his empty mug to Clara, his expression unreadable. "Fine. We'll deal with it when they come. Till then, keep her out of my way." He turned to leave, but a small figure appeared in the doorway, stopping him cold. Abigail stood there, dressed in a faded blue dress that Nate recognized with a visceral jolt, Emily's favorite, worn for Sunday services and the annual 4th of July picnic, preserved in a cedar chest like a shrine. On Abigail it was a touch short at the ankles, but it fit well enough, the soft cotton a stark contrast to her pale, shadowed face. Her eyes, still heavy with the nightmares Nate had heard her cry out against in the pre-dawn hours, moved from him to Jim and back again, alert and searching. Jim, remembering her terror at his bearded face the day before, took a cautious step back and tipped his hat. "Mornin', miss," he said, his gruff voice softened to a near whisper. "Good to see you up and about." Abigail didn't respond, but she didn't shrink away either, a small victory that Nate noted despite himself. Instead, she stepped onto the porch, her bare feet silent on the weathered boards, and approached the railing to gaze out over the ranch. Her expression remained unreadable, but her posture suggested she was cataloging the scene, the barns, the corral, the distant mountains, with the same intensity Nate had seen in her eyes the night before. "Breakfast's waitin'," Clara said, placing a protective hand near but not touching Abigail's shoulder. "Flapjacks and bacon, fresh from the griddle. You need to eat, child, to keep your strength." Abigail turned, her gaze locking onto Nate's, that same disconcerting directness that seemed to demand his approval, his guidance. It unnerved him, this unspoken expectation from a girl he barely knew. "Go on," he said, his voice rougher than intended. "Do as Clara says." After a moment's hesitation, Abigail nodded and followed Clara inside, but at the door she paused, looking back at Nate with a question in her eyes that he couldn't, or wouldn't, decipher. "Strange one, ain't she?" Jim observed once she was gone, his tone more curious than judgmental. "Harper says she hasn't spoken a word since they found her. Doc at the fort thinks it might be permanent, some kinda shock messin' with her mind." Nate's jaw tightened. "Not our problem," he said, though the words lacked the conviction they'd carried yesterday. "Let's focus on the cattle before McAllister tries to claim our strays as his own." He strode toward the stables, determined to lose himself in the physical demands of ranch work, where problems could be solved with sweat and steel, not the murky complexities of a child's trauma. The morning passed in a blur of mud and muscle, Nate and Jim riding hard to round up the scattered herd. The ground, churned to a treacherous mire by the storm, made every step a battle, but the work was a blessed reprieve from the thoughts that had kept Nate awake. By mid-afternoon, with the herd secured in the south pasture, they turned their horses toward home, the sun casting long shadows across the valley. As they crested the hill overlooking the ranch, Nate pulled up short, his hand instinctively drifting to his Colt. A wagon stood parked in front of the house, not Sheriff Harper's buckboard, but the gaudy, flower-painted rig belonging to Margaret Maggie Sullivan, Promise Creek's general store owner and the town's most notorious gossip. "That's all we need," Nate muttered, his voice low enough that only Jim could hear. "Whole damn territory'll know about the girl by sundown." Jim chuckled, a rare sound from the stoic foreman. "Likely already does. Ain't nothing travels faster than Maggie Sullivan's tongue." Nate considered veering toward the barns, avoiding the house until Maggie departed, but a glance at the porch changed his mind. Abigail stood in the doorway, her small frame rigid with discomfort, half hidden behind Clara as Maggie gestured animatedly, her voice carrying across the yard like a preacher's sermon. "And to think the poor dear saw such savagery," Maggie was saying, her plump hands fluttering like startled birds. "Henry says the army found 17 bodies, all scalped and worse. They're blammin' Blackfoot, but you know how folks pin every crime on the Indians when it's just as likely white outlaws in war paint." She broke off as Nate dismounted, handing Daisy's reins to Jim with a look that said, "Get scarce." Jim nodded, leading the horses toward the stables, leaving Nate to face the onslaught alone. "Mrs. Sullivan," Nate said, removing his hat with a courtesy colder than the creek in January. "This is an unexpected visit." Maggie, a woman of 45 whose bright calico dress clashed with the frontier's muted tones, beamed at him, her curls bouncing as she stepped forward. "Oh, Mr. Caldwell, I was just tellin' Clara. Sheriff Harper mentioned you'd taken in that poor orphan girl. I was droppin' supplies at the Wilsons. Their barn roof got torn clean off in the storm, can you imagine? And thought I'd bring some things for the child. Growin' girls need proper clothes, and I had my Ellie's old dresses packed away. Such a blessin' they can be used again." "Abigail," Clara corrected, her tone sharp enough to cut glass. "The girl's name is Abigail." Maggie waved a dismissive hand. "Of course, Abigail, that's right. Such a pretty name. Does she talk yet?" Harper said she was struck dumb by the horror of it all. "My cousin's boy was like that after seeing a bear maul his dog. Didn't speak for weeks, then woke up recitin' Bible verses like a circuit preacher. Strangest thing." Nate stepped onto the porch, deliberately positioning himself between Maggie and the door, his patience fraying like an old rope. "We appreciate your thoughtfulness, Mrs. Sullivan, but the girl's restin' now. Army'll send someone for her soon." Maggie's eyes widened, her hand flying to her chest in theatrical horror. Oh, surely you ain't sending her to those rough soldiers. A delicate child after such trauma needs a woman's care. Now, Reverend Mitchell's wife has her hands full with those fever orphans, but my Henry and I were just saying at breakfast how quiet our house has been since Ellie married and moved to Bozeman. She paused, her smile calculated, then added, "A man's home must feel so empty without children, Mr. Caldwell. I'm sure you understand that better than most." The deliberate reference to Laura and Emily sent a surge of cold anger through Nate, his hand tightening on the porch railing until his knuckles whitened. Clara made a small sound of disapproval, but before either could respond, a soft scuffing noise drew their attention. Abigail stood in the doorway again, her hair now pulled back with one of Emily's blue ribbons, her cheeks flushed with a high color that hadn't been there before. Maggie immediately pushed past Nate, her voice rising to a cloying sweetness. "There you are, you poor dear. I'm Mrs. Sullivan from Promise Creek. I brought you some lovely dresses. My Ellie's, she's grown and married now, living in Bozeman with a little one on the way. My husband and I would be delighted to give you a proper home till your kin can be found." She reached for Abigail's hand, but the girl stepped back quickly, bumping into the doorframe in her haste to avoid the contact. "She don't take kindly to being touched," Clara explained, moving to stand beside Abigail, her tone firm but kind. "Doc says it's common with severe shock." Maggie clucked her tongue, undeterred. "Poor little lamb. You'll feel better in a proper family home. A child needs a mother's love, especially after such an ordeal." Abigail's eyes darted to Nate, a question in them that he still couldn't parse, a plea perhaps or a challenge. "Mrs. Sullivan," Nate said, his patience now a threadbare scrap, "while we appreciate your concern, decisions about the girl's welfare are for the proper authorities. Now, if you'll excuse us, the storm left a mess that needs tending." Maggie drew herself up, her cheeks flushing at the dismissal. "Well, I was only trying to help, as any good Christian woman would." She glanced pointedly at Clara. "I'll leave the dresses, they are in the wagon. Henry can bring 'em up. No need to trouble your husband," Clara replied smoothly. "Tommy or one of the boys can fetch him before you go." It was a polite but unmistakable send-off, and Maggie had no choice but to comply, her skirts swishing with indignation as she descended the porch steps. "I'll be praying for the child," she called back, her voice dripping with pity, "and for you, Mr. Caldwell. The Lord knows how hard it must be, having a young girl in your house again after." Well, after everything. Nate's grip on the railing tightened, the wood creaking under his hand, but he held his tongue until Maggie had climbed into her wagon and signaled Henry to drive away. Clara muttered under her breath, "That woman's got the tact of a stampede-in herd." To everyone's surprise, a small sound came from Abigail, not quite a laugh but a soft huff, the first voluntary noise she'd made since arriving. Nate and Clara turned to her, startled, and for a fleeting moment, a ghost of a smile touched the girl's lips, as if Clara's bluntness had pierced her shell of silence. "Well," Clara said, clearly pleased, "at least someone's got taste. Come along, Abigail, let's see what's worth salvaging from Maggie's cast-offs. Woman's got a dreadful eye for fabric, but we'll make do." As they turned to go inside, Nate found himself reluctant to return to the pastures. That almost smile, so brief it might have been a trick of the light, had stirred something in him, a protectiveness he'd thought long burned away, a flicker of the man he'd been when Emily's laughter filled this house. "Mr. Caldwell," Clara called, pausing at the door, "will you be joining us for supper at the usual time?" It was her daily question, but today it carried a deeper meaning. Would he sit at the table with them, or retreat to his study as he had for 7 years, taking his meals alone with his ghosts? Nate looked at Abigail, standing silently beside Clara, her eyes meeting his with that same unspoken challenge. "Yes," he said finally, the word heavy with decision. The usual time. The sun had long dipped below the jagged peaks of the Bitterroot Mountains, leaving Caldwell Ranch bathed in the soft glow of kerosene lamps and the lingering warmth of Clara Bennett's kitchen. Inside the dining room, supper had been a quiet affair, the oak table set with the same precision Clara demanded of every task. Nathaniel Nate Caldwell sat at the head, his plate of venison stew and cornbread untouched for long stretches as he stole glances at Abigail Thornton, the girl whose presence had turned his ordered world upside down. She sat across from him, her small hands folded in her lap, picking at her food with the mechanical motions of someone who ate to survive, not to savor. Clara, presiding over the meal like a frontier matriarch, kept the conversation light. Talk of the storm's damage, the upcoming Promise Creek barn dance. But her sharp blue eyes missed nothing, noting the unspoken tension between Nate and the girl. Abigail's face, still pale from exhaustion and trauma, bore the marks of her ordeal. Faint scratches from the wagon train massacre, shadows under her eyes that spoke of nightmares no child should endure. Yet there was a new alertness in her gaze, a flicker of awareness that hadn't been there when Sheriff Amos Harper brought her to the ranch. She watched Nate with an intensity that unnerved him, as if he held the key to some unspoken question. When Clara cleared the plates and brought out a plate of apple dumplings, her specialty, reserved for special occasions, Abigail's eyes lingered on the dessert, a ghost of longing passing over her features. "Go on, child," Clara urged, sliding a dumpling onto her plate. "Ain't nobody ever said no to my apple dumplings, not even the pickiest ranch hand." Abigail hesitated, then took a small bite, her expression softening for a fleeting moment. Nate felt an unexpected pang, a memory of Emily at this same table, her laughter filling the room as she begged for just one more of Clara's sweets. He pushed the thought away, focusing instead on the ledger he'd brought to the table, a shield against the emotions the girl stirred. "Storm's gonna cost us," he said gruffly, flipping through the pages. "New shingles, fence repairs, and that creek's gonna need dredging before it floods the lower pasture." Clara nodded, jotting notes in her ever-present ledger. "I'll talk to Henry Sullivan about lumber prices when I'm in town. Maggie's husband might be a fool for marrying her, but he knows his timber." The mention of Maggie Sullivan brought a faint huff from Abigail, so soft it might have gone unnoticed if Nate hadn't been watching her. Clara's lips twitched, a rare smile breaking through her stern facade. "Seems our guest agrees with my opinion of Maggie's tact," she said, winking at Abigail. The girl's eyes flicked to Clara, then back to Nate, and for a moment the dining room felt almost like a home again, not the mausoleum it had become after Laura and Emily's deaths. But the moment passed, and Abigail's gaze returned to her plate, her silence a reminder of the chasm between her world and theirs. After supper, Nate retreated to his study, the one room in the house where he could still feel in control. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting shadows across the polished oak desk, and the maps pinned to the walls, charts of Silver Creek Valley, marked with every fence line, water source, and grazing pasture that made Caldwell Ranch a titan in the Montana Territory. He settled into his leather chair, intending to review the ranch accounts, but his thoughts kept drifting to the girl upstairs. Clara had taken her to the guest room, promising to sit with her until she fell asleep, but Nate couldn't shake the image of Abigail's eyes, fixed on him as if he were her only anchor in a storm-tossed sea. A soft knock at the door startled him from his reverie. He looked up to find Abigail standing in the doorway, clutching the worn copy of the Swiss Family Robinson he'd read to her during the storm. Her hair was neatly braided for sleep, the blue ribbon a stark contrast to the plain cotton nightgown, another of Emily's, a fact that twisted Nate's gut like a rusty knife. Her eyes, though heavy with fatigue, were alert, showing no sign of the drowsiness he'd expected. "It's late," he said, setting aside his ledger. "You should be in bed." Abigail took a tentative step into the room, then held out the book, her expression a silent question. Nate hesitated, the weight of the previous night's reading session pressing against his resolve. That had been an exception, a moment born of the storm's chaos. To read to her again would suggest a routine, a connection he wasn't prepared to forge. "Clara can read to you," he said, turning back to his accounts. "She's got a better voice for it than me." He expected her to leave, perhaps with a flicker of disappointment, but instead, she crossed the room with a quiet determination that caught him off guard. She placed the book directly on top of his ledger, forcing him to meet her gaze. Nate leaned back in his chair, a reluctant admiration stirring beneath his irritation. "You're a stubborn one, ain't you?" he said, his voice softer than he intended. Abigail nodded solemnly, then pointed again at the book, her meaning unmistakable. Nate sighed, his defenses crumbling under the weight of her silent insistence. "One chapter," he conceded, "then bed." A hint of triumph flickered in her eyes as she settled into the chair opposite his desk, tucking her feet beneath her and watching him expectantly. He opened the book to where they'd left off, his deep voice filling the room with the tale of the stranded family's adventures. The treehouse stood strong against the gale, its branches swaying but unbroken. As he read, Abigail's posture relaxed, her small frame sinking into the chair, the tension in her face easing with each word. Nate found himself wondering what her voice sounded like. This silent, resolute child, who communicated more with a glance than most men did with a speech. He imagined it soft but steady, like the creek after a spring thaw, carrying a strength that belied her fragile appearance. From the hallway, unseen by either Nate or Abigail, Clara observed the scene, her arms crossed, and a quiet satisfaction in her eyes. She'd seen Nate's walls, built brick by brick over 7 years of grief, and she knew the girl's presence was chipping away at them, whether he admitted it or not. The road ahead would be long, for the man who'd lost everything and the child who'd survived the unthinkable. But tonight, in the glow of the firelight, a small bridge had been built, fragile but real. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, the valley sparkling under a fresh layer of dew as the ranch hands set to work repairing the storm's damage. The air rang with the rhythmic thud of hammers and the shouts of men hauling timber, a symphony of purpose that Nate usually found grounding. But today, as he stood in the stables discussing breeding plans with Jim Donovan, his thoughts were elsewhere, tangled in the mystery of the girl upstairs. Jim, his broad face creased with concern, was outlining the spring calf projections when Tommy Weaver burst through the stable doors, out of breath and wide-eyed. "Mr. Caldwell," Tommy gasped, his lanky frame trembling with excitement. "Riders Common, looks like an army patrol. 6 men moving fast." Nate handed the breeding records back to Jim, his expression hardening. "Probably about the girl." "Tell Clara." Jim nodded, his own unease mirroring Nate's as he headed toward the house. By the time Nate reached the main yard, the soldiers were dismounting, their blue uniforms travel-stained but crisp, their faces grim under the brims of their kepis. 5 enlisted men flanked a young officer Nate didn't recognize, his polished buttons and stiff posture marking him as fresh from West Point. "Lieutenant Samuel Carter, 5th Cavalry." The officer introduced himself with a crisp salute, his voice carrying the clipped precision of a man trained to command. "Are you Nathaniel Caldwell?" Nate nodded, his hand resting casually near his Colt, a habit born of years in a territory where trust was earned, not given. "That's me. What's the army want with my ranch?" Carter removed his hat, revealing a face too young for the weight it carried. "I need to confirm the girl you're sheltering was found hidden in a false compartment beneath a wagon floor on the Bozeman Trail." "That's what Sheriff Harper told me," Nate replied, his tone neutral but his senses sharpened. "He brought her here 2 days ago." "What's this about?" Carter's gaze was steady, but there was a tension in his posture that set Nate's instincts on edge. "I need to inform you of a developing situation," the lieutenant said, lowering his voice. "The attack on that wagon train wasn't random. Our scouts found evidence it was targeted, wagons searched methodically, bodies arranged in a way that suggests they were questioned before being killed." Nate's frown deepened, a cold prickle of alertness stirring in his chest. "Targeted by whom?" Carter shook his head, his expression grim. "We're not certain yet, but there's reason to believe the attackers were looking for something, or someone. Every wagon was torn apart before being burned." Nate's thoughts raced to Abigail, her silent terror, the journal clutched like a lifeline. "What's this got to do with the girl?" he asked, though he already suspected the answer. Carter hesitated, glancing at his men before continuing. "You believe her name is Abigail Thornton, based on a journal found in the wagon. But according to our investigation, there was no Abigail Thornton traveling with that train. The journal belonged to Mary Thornton, yes, but she and her husband James were a childless couple from Pennsylvania, not Illinois. They were traveling with his elderly father, no daughter." The words hit Nate like a rifle butt to the chest, his mind scrambling to process the implications. "Then who is she?" he demanded, his voice low but edged with urgency. Carter's eyes met his, unflinching. "That's what we need to find out, and why someone might still be hunting her. I have orders to take her to Fort Benton for her protection while we investigate." "Colonel's orders." A surge of unexpected protectiveness rose in Nate, sharp and unyielding. He thought of Abigail's fearful eyes, the way she'd flinched from Jim's beard, the almost smile she'd given at Clara's quip. "She's traumatized, Lieutenant," he said, his tone hard. "Hasn't spoken, barely eats. Moving her now could break what little hold she's got left." Carter's jaw tightened, torn between duty and reason. "With respect, sir, leaving her here could be dangerous, for her and for you. Whoever attacked that wagon train left no survivors for a reason. If they learn she escaped..." The implication hung heavy between them, a shadow of danger that Nate felt as keenly as the weight of his Colt. He thought of the Blackwell gang, the outlaws who'd taken his family 7 years ago, their leader's Navajo silver bracelet a taunting memory. Could this be connected? The thought was a spark in dry grass, igniting a resolve he hadn't felt in years. "Give me 3 days," he said finally, his voice firm. "She's just starting to feel safe here. I'll try to get her to share what she knows. If she's in danger, we need to understand why before we risk breaking her further." Carter considered this, his youthful face betraying the conflict between orders and logic. 3 days, he agreed reluctantly. "But I'll leave 2 of my men here as guards, Private Ellis and Corporal Hayes. If there's any sign of trouble, we move her immediately." Nate nodded, sealing the agreement, but as he showed the lieutenant out, a chill settled in his bones. Abigail, or whoever she was, had brought more than her silent grief to Caldwell Ranch. She'd brought a danger that echoed the ghosts of his past, a threat as real and relentless as the storm that had heralded her arrival. The morning sun climbed high over Silver Creek Valley, its golden light glinting off the dew-soaked grasses and the freshly repaired corral fence of Caldwell Ranch. Nathaniel Nate Caldwell stood in the kitchen, the aroma of Clara Bennett's biscuits and bacon filling the air, but his appetite was as absent as the sleep that had eluded him. The revelation from Lieutenant Samuel Carter, that the girl they called Abigail Thornton might not be who she seemed, had settled over the ranch like a storm cloud, heavy with unspoken threats. Abigail, or whoever she was, sat at the oak dining table, her small frame dwarfed by the chair, her eyes fixed on a bowl of oatmeal she hadn't touched. The blue dress, Emily's dress, hung on her like a ghost shroud, and the ribbon in her braided hair only deepened the ache in Nate's chest. Clara, bustling at the stove, kept up a steady stream of chatter to fill the silence, her voice a lifeline in the tense room. Tommy says the creek's still running high, but it ain't likely to flood the pasture now. And Jim's got the boys fixin' the stable roof before noon. Ain't no sense letting a little storm slow us down. She set a plate before Nate, 3 eggs, 4 strips of bacon, 2 biscuits, arranged with her usual precision, and glanced at Abigail, her sharp eyes softening. "Eat up, child. You need strength to face the day, and I ain't one for wasting good food." Abigail's gaze flicked to Clara, then to Nate, her expression unreadable but her posture tense, as if she sensed the questions hanging in the air. Nate pushed his plate aside, his mind churning with Carter's words. No Abigail Thornton. Childless couple. Someone might still be hunting her. The Army's presence, Private Ellis in the bunkhouse, Corporal Hayes stationed at the watchtower, only heightened the sense of a ranch under siege. "Clara," Nate said, his voice low, "that journal from the wagon train. Bring it out again. We need to know who she is." Clara nodded, retrieving the leather-bound book from a locked drawer in the sideboard, her movements careful, as if handling a sacred relic. She placed it on the table, and Abigail's eyes widened, her small hands clenching in her lap. "Yours?" Nate asked, his tone gentle but firm, hoping to coax some response. Abigail shook her head, then nodded, a gesture that spoke of both ownership and loss, her mother's words the last tether to a world torn apart. Clara opened the journal, her voice steady as she read, "Property of Mary Elizabeth Thornton. Journey began April 10th, 1876, from Springfield, Pennsylvania to Montana Territory." She turned a page, scanning the neat handwriting. "April 15th, crossed the Platte River today. James is hopeful we'll reach Bozeman by June." The girl is quiet, but her eyes miss nothing. Abigail's breath hitched at the mention of the girl, her face betraying a flicker of emotion, yearning, fear, a desperate connection to the words. Nate leaned forward, his voice softening. "Is that you she's written about?" Abigail's eyes met his, and for a moment he thought she might speak, but she only nodded, a single definitive motion. Clara continued, "April 20th, Abigail turned 13 today. James carved her a wooden sparrow, named Jasper after her granddaddy. She says she'll start her own journal when we reach Montana, to record our new life." Abigail's trembling intensified, silent tears tracing paths down her cheeks, the first crack in the dam of her grief since the night before. Nate felt the weight of her pain, a mirror of his own loss 7 years ago, when the Blackwell gang had left him nothing but ashes and guilt. "Enough for now," he said, his voice rough with emotion he couldn't name. "She needs time." Clara closed the journal, her expression a mix of concern and resolve. "I'll sit with her this morning. Maybe she'll open up if we give her space." Nate shook his head, surprising himself. "No. I'll talk to her. You've got enough with the storm cleanup. Take Ellis with you to check the lower pasture. Make sure the cattle ain't wandering too close to McAllister's line." Clara's eyebrows rose, but she nodded, her lips twitching with a knowing smile. "As you wish, Nate. I'll leave her breakfast on the sideboard. Try to get her to eat." As Clara left, Nate turned to Abigail, who was watching him with that unnerving intensity, her tears drying but her eyes bright with something new, trust perhaps, or a plea. "We need to know who you are," he said, keeping his voice low, steady. "Not just for you, but for everyone here. If someone's after you, we need to be ready." Abigail's gaze dropped to the journal, her fingers brushing its cover as if drawing strength from it. She didn't speak, didn't move, but the air between them felt charged, a silent agreement that the truth, whatever it was, couldn't stay buried much longer. Before Nate could press further, a sharp whistle cut through the morning quiet, Corporal Hayes's signal from the watchtower, indicating approaching riders. Nate's hand drifted to his Colt, his instincts honed by years of war and loss snapping into focus. "Stay here," he told Abigail, rising and moving to the window. 3 riders approached from the south trail, their horses kicking up dust in the morning light. They weren't army, not in uniform, but their purposeful pace and the glint of weapons at their sides set Nate's nerves on edge. "Clara," he called, striding toward the door. "Get Abigail upstairs. Tell Ellis to stay with her. Hayes, take position at the front." Clara appeared, her face tightening as she saw the riders. She spoke quietly to Abigail, guiding her toward the stairs, the girl's eyes darting to Nate with a mix of fear and resignation, as if she'd been expecting this moment. Jim Donovan burst into the kitchen from the back door, his broad face grim. "Civilian's boss but armed. Look like trouble." Nate grabbed his Winchester from the rack, checking the chamber with mechanical precision. "Get Tommy and Sammy ready, but keep him out of sight in the barn. Let's see what these fellas want before we show our hand." By the time the riders reached the main yard, Nate stood on the porch, rifle held casually but visibly, Corporal Hayes positioned at the house's corner, his carbine at the ready. The lead rider was a tall man with a neatly trimmed beard and clothes too fine for the frontier, pressed wool coat, polished boots, a silk vest that screamed city money. His companions were rougher, one wiry, with a pockmarked face and restless eyes, the other broad-shouldered, a jagged scar running from temple to jaw, his hand never straying far from the revolver at his hip. "Good afternoon," the leader called, reining in his horse a respectful distance away, his voice smooth as a saloon gambler's. "I'm looking for Nathaniel Caldwell." "You found him," Nate replied, his stance unwavering. "What's your business here?" The man dismounted with the easy grace of someone accustomed to command, his smile revealing perfect teeth that seemed out of place in the dust of Silver Creek Valley. "My name is Edward Langley," he said, reaching slowly into his coat, noting Nate's watchful gaze and withdrawing a leather folio. "I represent the Pacific Northern Railroad Company. I have credentials, if you'd care to examine them." Nate nodded for Hayes to retrieve the documents. The corporal did so, his eyes never leaving the other 2 men who remained mounted, their postures tense. The papers were official-looking, letterhead, company seal, signatures of railroad executives Nate had read about in the Helena Gazette. Langley was identified as a special investigator for the company, a title that raised more questions than it answered. "What does the railroad want with my ranch, Mr. Langley?" Nate asked, handing the papers back to Hayes. Langley's smile widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Not your ranch, Mr. Caldwell. Information. We're tracking a fugitive, a young girl who witnessed something she shouldn't have and fled with documents belonging to the company." Nate kept his expression neutral, though his pulse quickened, Carter's warning echoing in his mind. Someone might still be hunting her. "What kind of documents?" he asked, his voice steady. "Company ledgers, financial records," Langley replied smoothly, his hands gesturing airily. "Internal matters, meaningless to most, but in the wrong hands," he shrugged, an elegant motion that didn't match the hardness in his gaze. Corporate espionage is a serious concern, Mr. Caldwell. Nate's eyes narrowed. And what's this got to do with me? Langley's smile tightened, a predator's patience wearing thin. We have reason to believe the girl was traveling with a wagon train that met with tragedy near here. The Army has been cooperative, and they mentioned a survivor was brought to your ranch, a young girl. Nate noted how Langley avoided mentioning the massacre directly, his words too careful, too rehearsed. News travels fast, he said, his tone dry. It's my job to stay informed, Langley countered, his voice silk over steel. Is she here, Mr. Caldwell? The girl from the wagon train. Nate weighed his options. Denying Abigail's presence was pointless with Army guards visible, but something about Langley, the too perfect smile, the vague answers, set his hackles rising. A girl was brought here, yes, he said finally. Traumatized, hasn't spoken. Sheriff Harper's arranging a place for her in town. Langley's companions exchanged glances, a subtle shift that didn't escape Nate's notice. I'd like to see her if I may, Langley said, his tone polite but insistent. To confirm if she's the one we're seeking. The railroad would be most grateful for her safe return. There's a substantial reward. Nate's grip on the Winchester tightened. She's wrist in now, doctor's orders. And frankly, Mr. Langley, I find it peculiar that the railroad sends 3 armed men to track down one scared girl. Langley's smile didn't waver, but his eyes grew colder, like a winter sky before a blizzard. Corporate matters can be complex, Mr. Caldwell, and the Montana Territory ain't exactly a Sunday picnic. My associates, Mr. Travers and Mr. Kane, are my security detail. The scarred man, presumably Kane, shifted in his saddle, his coat falling open to reveal a holstered revolver. But it wasn't the weapon that caught Nate's attention. It was the silver and turquoise bracelet on Kane's wrist, its Navajo craftsmanship unmistakable. A memory surged, unbidden. Emily's 10th birthday, Laura buying her a similar bracelet at a trading post in Bozeman, the way her face lit up as she slipped it on her small wrist. The Blackwell gang's leader, Silas Blackwell, had worn one just like it when he'd burned Nate's world to ash. We can return tomorrow if that's more convenient, Langley continued, interpreting Nate's silence as hesitation. Though time is of the essence, Nate made his decision, his voice calm but edged with steel. Tomorrow's better. Noon. We'll expect you for dinner. Langley nodded, apparently satisfied, and remounted his horse. Until tomorrow, then. As the riders departed, Nate remained on the porch, watching until they vanished into the valley's haze approaching with a serious expression. Sir, didn't the lieutenant say not to let anyone know about the girl? He did, Nate said, his eyes still on the road. Get Jim. Tell him to send our fastest rider to Fort Benton with a message for Lieutenant Carter. Tell him our railroad investigators have arrived. Inside, Nate found Clara descending the stairs, her face pale. She's with Private Ellis in the guest room, she reported. Who were those men? Nate moved to the gun cabinet, selecting additional ammunition with deliberate care. Claimed to be from the railroad, looking for a girl who stole company documents. But the one with the scar, Kane, he's wearing Navajo silver like the bracelet Laura bought Emily. Clara's hand flew to her mouth, her voice barely a whisper. Like the Blackwell gang, Nate loaded cartridges into his belt, his movements mechanical but his mind racing. Could be coincidence. That jewelry's common enough in some parts. But I don't trust him and we need answers fast. He turned toward the stairs. I'm talking to the girl. Abigail sat on the window seat in the guest room, her gaze fixed on the departing riders with the intensity of a hawk tracking prey. Private Ellis stood nearby, his carbine ready but his demeanor gentle, trying to engage her with small talk. "She don't miss much, sir," Ellis said as Nate entered. "Been watching those fellas like she could burn holes through 'em." Nate approached the window, standing beside Abigail, his voice low. "You recognize 'em, don't you?" Her head snapped up, her eyes meeting his, the raw fear in them answer enough. "Ellis, give us a moment. Wait outside." When they were alone, Nate pulled a chair close, sitting at eye level with Abigail. "Those men are looking for you. They'll be back tomorrow, and I need to know what I'm dealing with." Her expression closed, her hands clenching in her lap, but Nate pressed on, his tone softening. "You don't have to speak, but I need to understand. Clara thinks you might open up if I share my story first." Abigail tilted her head, curiosity breaking through her fear, and Nate took a deep breath, forcing himself to confront the past he'd buried. "7 years ago, this ranch was different," he began, his voice steady but heavy. Louder, happier. "My wife, Laura, loved music, always humming, singing hymns, driven me half crazy sometimes." A ghost of a smile touched his lips, then vanished. "Our daughter Emily was 10. Smart as a whip, loved books, horses, and turning my orderly life upside down." Abigail's gaze remained fixed on him, absorbing every word. "I was away when it happened, in Helena, testifying against cattle rustlers we'd caught. A gang came, 7 men, former soldiers turned outlaws, calling themselves the Blackwell Gang. Their leader, Silas Blackwell, wore a Navajo silver bracelet, just like the one that man Cain had today." Abigail's eyes widened, her breathing quickening, and Nate pushed through the pain rising in his chest. "They killed 2 ranch hands, took what they could carry, and found Laura and Emily trying to escape through the back pasture. The hands who survived said Laura fought like a she-bear, giving Emily a chance to run, but she didn't get far enough." The silence was absolute, broken only by the distant hammering of the ranch hands outside. "I wasn't here to protect them," Nate continued, the admission like broken glass. "By the time I got back, the army had found their bodies in the creek bed. I tracked the Blackwells for 2 years, found 5 of them, made sure they faced justice. 2 got away, Silas and his brother Caleb. Last I heard, they'd moved to California." He refocused on Abigail's face, seeing understanding dawn in her eyes, followed by a sharper fear. "That bracelet today, it's too close to be chance. If those men are tied to the Blackwells, they're dangerous in ways you might not grasp." Abigail bit her lip, indecision plain, then slid off the window seat and retrieved a small satchel from under the bed, Clara's provision for her few possessions. From its depths, she withdrew a folded packet of papers, thrusting them toward Nate with trembling hands. He took them carefully, unfolding a letter dated April 2nd, 1876, addressed to "My dearest brother, Benjamin," and signed "Your loving sister, Elizabeth." "Is this your mother?" Nate asked. "Elizabeth," Abigail shook her head, then pointed to the signature and to herself. "Your Elizabeth," Nate clarified, surprised. "This is your written," she nodded, motioning for him to read. The letter detailed concerns about financial improprieties at the Pacific Northern Railroad's Western office, where Elizabeth apparently worked as a clerk, falsified land claims, missing funds, threats when I questioned them. Behind the letter were ledgers, deeds with altered boundaries, and a list of names with sums beside them, evidence of fraud on a scale that could topple empires. "You took these from the railroad office," Nate said, the pieces falling into place. "That's why they're hunting you." Elizabeth Abigail no longer nodded solemnly, her eyes bright with fear and resolve. Nate's jaw tightened, a cold fury rising at the thought of a child targeted for uncovering corruption. "The Thorntons, the folks from the Wagon train." Elizabeth made a writing motion, and Nate handed her a pencil and paper from the desk. Her handwriting was neat despite her shaking hands. Mary and James Thornton were taking me to my brother in Helena. They said I was their daughter, Abigail, for safety. Mr. Thornton worked for the railroad, helped me escape after Mr. Langley threatened me. Nate's mind raced, the implications chilling. Langley found out Thornton was helping you. He sent men after the wagon train, men tied to the Blackwells. Elizabeth wrote again, her words hurried. I didn't know they'd kill everyone. It's my fault. No, Nate said firmly, his voice cutting through her guilt. Men like Langley and Blackwell make their own choices. The blood's on their hands, not yours. He refolded the documents, his resolve hardening. This explains why they're so desperate to find you. These papers could hang him all for fraud, maybe murder. A knock at the door interrupted them. Private Ellis poked his head in. Sir, Clara says supper's ready and Corporal Hayes wants a word. Nate turned to Elizabeth. We need to get you and these papers to safety. Your brother in Helena might be in danger if they know about him. Her face crumpled and she grabbed the pencil. Benjamin is dead. Killed in a robbery 2 days before I fled. The Thorntons were taking me to a federal marshal in Helena, investigating the railroad. Nate felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. These men were methodical, eliminating anyone tied to their schemes. The fact that they'd tracked Elizabeth to his ranch meant resources beyond ordinary outlaws. We'll figure this out, he promised, though the path forward was murky. For now, stay here with Ellis. Clary'll bring your supper up. Elizabeth caught his arm as he rose, her expression pleading. She scribbled one final note. They'll hurt you and everyone here to get to me. I should go with them tomorrow. That ain't happening, Nate said, his voice hardening with a resolve he hadn't felt in years. I've spent 7 years hidden from the world, Elizabeth. Maybe it's time I remembered how to fight. Downstairs, Corporal Hayes waited in the study, his young face grave. Sir, I sent Tommy to Fort Benton with your message, but there's something else. When those men rode up, I recognized the one with the scar, Kane. He was at Fort Benton last week, talking with Lieutenant Brooks, who's under investigation for taking bribes. Nate processed this, his expression grim. So they've got friends at the fort. We need to be ready for anything. A ranch under siege, the plan unfolds. Silver Creek Valley, Montana Territory, April 1876. The afternoon sun hung low over Silver Creek Valley, casting long shadows across the sprawling pastures of Caldwell Ranch, where the air buzzed with the quiet urgency of a fortress preparing for battle. Nathaniel Nate Caldwell stood in the barn, the scent of hay and leather mingling with the sharp tang of gun oil as he checked his Winchester's chamber for the 3rd time. The revelation of Elizabeth's true identity, not Abigail Thornton, but a fugitive carrying evidence of Pacific Northern Railroad's corruption, had transformed the ranch from a sanctuary into a battleground. Edward Langley and his men, with their polished lies and Navajo silver bracelets, were coming back at noon tomorrow, and Nate knew they weren't after a polite chat over Clara Bennett's biscuits. Inside the house, Clara presided over the kitchen, her usual efficiency sharpened by the stakes. She'd spent the morning organizing supplies, bandages, extra ammunition, a pot of stew simmering for the hands, while keeping an eye on Elizabeth, who sat silently at the dining table, her small hands clutching the satchel that held the damning documents. The girl's face was pale, her eyes shadowed with a fear that Nate recognized too well, but there was a new resolve in her posture, a spark of the defiance that had carried her through the massacre on the Bozeman Trail. Clara, ever the pragmatist, had laid out a plan to keep the ranch running smoothly while they prepared for the worst, her ledger now doubling as a war journal. Tommy's ridden to Fort Benton with your message, she reported, stirring the stew with a wooden spoon. Should reach Lieutenant Carter by nightfall, if the trails ain't too muddy. Nate nodded, his mind racing through the logistics of their defense. Corporal Hayes was stationed in the watchtower, his carbine trained on the approaches to the ranch, while Private Ellis patrolled the bunkhouse, his youthful energy tempered by the gravity of their situation. Jim Donovan, the foreman, had rallied the ranch hands, Tommy Weaver, Sammy Holt, and 2 others, to strategic positions. Sammy in the barn, pretending to mend harnesses but with a rifle hidden nearby. The others scattered across the property, maintaining the appearance of routine chores while keeping weapons close. The ranch was a well-oiled machine, but Nate knew it wasn't built for a siege, and Langley's men had the look of professionals, not common outlaws. "We need to get Elizabeth out before they come back," Nate said, his voice low to avoid carrying beyond the kitchen. "Those papers she's got, they are a death sentence for her and anyone near her." Clara's spoon paused, her sharp blue eyes meeting his. "You're sending her away?" "After all she's been through." Nate's jaw tightened, the weight of the decision pressing like a millstone. "Ain't about what I want, Clara. Langley's tied to the Blackwells, or someone just as bad. If they find her here, it won't just be her they kill. It'll be all of us." Elizabeth's head snapped up at the mention of her name, her gaze locking onto Nate's with that unnerving intensity that seemed to see through his carefully built walls. She scribbled a note on a scrap of paper Clara had given her, her handwriting neat despite the tremor in her fingers. "I can't let you die for me. I'll go with them tomorrow." Nate shook his head, his voice firm. "That ain't an option, Elizabeth. You're going to Fort Ellis, to a federal marshal who can protect you and those papers. Jim and Ellis will take you through Eagle Pass at first light, before Langley's men get here." Clara frowned, setting the spoon down with a clatter. "Eagle Pass? That's rough country, Nate, even for a grown man. And in the dark. You're asking a lot of a child." Nate's eyes didn't waver. "Jim knows those mountains like the back of his hand. Ellis is a good soldier, and Elizabeth's tougher than she looks. It's the only way to keep her clear of this fight." Elizabeth scribbled again, her words urgent. "They'll know I'm gone. They'll hurt you." Nate met her gaze, his voice softening but unyielding. "Let me worry about that. My job's to keep you safe, and I ain't failed at that yet." The plan had come together in the hours since Langley's departure, born of necessity and Nate's growing sense of responsibility for the girl who'd breached his defenses. Jim would lead Elizabeth and Private Ellis north through Eagle Pass, a narrow, pine-shrouded trail that offered cover but demanded skill to navigate. They'd aim for Fort Ellis, where Federal Marshal Jeremiah Tate, a man Nate had known from his Army days, could take custody of the documents and ensure Elizabeth's safety. Meanwhile, Nate would hold Langley at the ranch, buying time with a carefully staged deception, hoping Tommy's message would bring Carter's cavalry before the situation turned deadly. Clara, ever practical, had suggested a disguise for Elizabeth to avoid detection on the trail. "She'll go as a boy," she'd said, pulling out a pair of trousers, a wool coat, and a wide-brimmed hat that had belonged to a young ranch hand. "Less likely to draw eyes that way." Elizabeth had nodded, her fear tempered by a determination that Nate couldn't help but admire. She'd written another note, her words simple but heavy. "I don't want to leave you, but I trust you." The trust in those words hit Nate like a physical blow, a reminder of the stakes beyond the ranch's borders. As evening fell, the ranch settled into an uneasy quiet, the hands finishing their chores under the watchful eyes of Hayes and Ellis. Nate gathered Jim and Ellis in the barn, the flickering lantern casting long shadows across the hay-strewn floor. Elizabeth stood nearby, dressed in her disguise, trousers tucked into sturdy boots, her hair pinned up under the hat, the satchel of documents clutched tightly to her chest. From a distance, she could pass for a slender youth of 12, but up close, her pale face and wide eyes betrayed the weight she carried. "Good thinkin'," Nate said, kneeling to check Elizabeth's boots, ensuring they were laced for the long ride. "Less attention you draw, the better." Elizabeth handed him a folded note, her handwriting steady despite the circumstances. "Thank you for risking everything for a stranger. I won't forget this." Nate's throat tightened, the words striking a chord he hadn't felt since Emily's laughter filled this barn. "You ain't a stranger anymore," he said simply, the truth of it surprising him. In just a few days, this silent, stubborn girl had become more than a guest. She'd become a reason to fight, to reclaim the man he'd buried 7 years ago. Private Ellis entered, his rifle slung over his shoulder, his young face serious. "Perimeter's clear, sir. No sign of anyone watching the ranch. Corporal Hayes is in the tower, got eyes on all approaches." Nate nodded, turning to Elizabeth. "Ellis and Jim will keep you safe. Follow their orders, no questions. When you reach Fort Ellis, ask for Marshal Tate. Show him the documents and tell him everything. He's a good man, knew my wife's brother in the war. He'll protect you." Elizabeth nodded, then did something unexpected. She stepped forward and wrapped her arms around Nate's waist in a fierce hug. For a moment, he stood frozen, the warmth of her embrace a shock after years of isolation. Then, awkwardly, he placed a hand on her shoulder, hoping it conveyed the reassurance she needed. "Go on," he said gruffly, stepping back. "You need to be deep in the past before Langley shows up." Jim helped Elizabeth mount a sturdy pony, adjusting the stirrups for her shorter legs, while Ellis swung into his own saddle, checking his weapons with practiced ease. "We'll take the North Trail through the pines," Jim explained, his voice steady despite the tension. "Stays under cover most of the way. If all goes well, we'll hit Eagle Pass by nightfall." Nate nodded, his eyes scanning the darkening horizon. "I'll keep Langley here as long as I can. With luck, Tommy'll be back with Carter's men before they figure out she's gone." Clara stepped forward, pressing a small bundle into Elizabeth's hands, cornbread and honey, wrapped in a clean cloth. "For when the trail gets hard," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Elizabeth's eyes glistened as she tucked the gift into her coat, then gave Nate a final nod before turning her pony toward the barn's rear door, which opened onto a trail leading into the forest bordering the ranch's northern edge. As the small party vanished into the pre-dawn shadows, Clara sighed, her hands on her hips. "You think they'll make it?" Nate's gaze lingered on the tree line long after the riders were gone. "Jim knows those mountains better than anyone alive, and Ellis is a solid soldier. They've got a fighting chance." Clara studied him, her sharp eyes seeing more than he wanted. "And us? What's our chance when Langley finds out she's gone?" Nate turned toward the house, his expression hardening into the cold mask he'd worn for 7 years. "Let's make breakfast, Clara. We're expecting company for lunch." By mid-morning, Nate had positioned the ranch hands with military precision, a nod to his days as a cavalry sergeant. Sammy Holt and 2 others were stationed in the barn, hammers and nails in hand to mask their rifles nearby. Tommy Weaver hadn't returned from Fort Benton, a delay that could mean trouble or simply storm-damaged trails, but Nate couldn't afford to wait. Corporal Hayes remained in the watchtower, his field glasses sweeping the valley, while Nate moved between the house and outbuildings, maintaining the facade of a normal day's work while keeping sightlines clear. Clara, in the kitchen, had transformed the dining room into a stage for their deception. The table was set with her best china, white with a delicate blue rim, a wedding gift from her late husband, adorned with wildflowers from her garden, their vibrant yellows and purples a stark contrast to the tension in the air. The aroma of fresh-baked bread and venison stew filled the house, a deliberate ploy to keep Langley and his men seated longer, buying time for Elizabeth's escape. "Bread's almost done," Clara announced as Nate entered, her apron dusted with flour. "Stew's been simmering since dawn. Those fellas won't have cause to complain about Caldwell hospitality." Nate raised an eyebrow at her elaborate preparations, a rarity for a woman who prided herself on practicality. "You're pulling out all the stops," Clara shrugged, a glint of steel in her eyes. "The longer they sit eatin', the farther Jim and the girl get. Besides, best they don't suspect nothin' till they're good and settled." Nate's lips twitched, a rare flicker of amusement. "You're a formidable woman, Clara Bennett." She checked the oven, her face growing serious. 7 years running, this house taught me a thing or two, Nate. But I need to say something before things get hairy." Nate waited, sensing the weight behind her words. Clara straightened, her voice softening. "When I came here, after losing my husband to the fever and my boy to the war, I understood your silence, your need for order. I respected it. But seeing you with that girl these past days, it's the first time you've looked alive since I known you. Whatever happens today, I think Laura would be proud of the man you're becoming again." Before Nate could respond, Hayes's sharp whistle pierced the air, the signal for approaching riders. Nate checked his Colt, his movements automatic, and moved to the window. 3 riders, he confirmed, watching dust rise on the south trail. "Right on time." Clara nodded, all business once more. "I'll finish setting the table. You greet our guests." Edward Langley and his companions arrived precisely at noon, their horses reined in with the casual confidence of men unaware they were being watched through rifle sights. Langley dismounted, his silk vest gleaming in the sunlight, while Travers, the wiry one, and Kane, the scarred man with the Navajo bracelet, scanned the property with professional assessment. "Mr. Caldwell," Langley called, removing his hat with a flourish. "As agreed. I hope we find you well." "Well enough," Nate replied, his voice even, gesturing toward the pump by the barn. "You can wash up there if you like. Clara's got dinner ready." Kane's eyes lingered on the watchtower, where Hayes was carefully concealed, his hand never straying far from his revolver. "Quite an operation you've got," Langley observed as they moved toward the house, his tone conversational but probing. "I hear Caldwell Ranch is the pride of Silver Creek Valley." Nate shrugged, deliberately modest. "We get by. Land's good if you respect it." Inside, Clara had outdone herself, the dining room a picture of frontier elegance. The wildflowers glowed in the sunlight streaming through the windows, and the aroma of stew and bread was enough to make a man forget his troubles, if only for a moment. She greeted the visitors with cool politeness, directing them to their seats with the authority of a schoolmarm herding wayward pupils. "The girl will be joining us?" Langley inquired, his tone casual but his eyes sharp as he scanned the room. "She's restin'," Nate said, taking his seat at the head of the table, his Winchester propped against the wall within reach. "Doc's still worried about her. Shock hits kids hard." Langley's smile tightened, a flicker of impatience breaking through his polished facade. "Of course. Perhaps after we eat then." "Depends on how she's feelin'," Nate replied, non-committal, his eyes flicking to Kane, whose vigilant gaze never settled, and Travers, who ate with the mechanical efficiency of a hired gun. The meal passed in strained civility, conversation skirting the edges of ranch operations, the storm's impact, and Langley's alleged railroad business. Clara served with brisk efficiency, her presence a quiet anchor, but Nate could feel the tension coiling tighter with each passing minute. As she brought out coffee and a tray of peach cobbler, another rarity, meant to prolong the meal, Langley finally steered the conversation to his true purpose. "Mr. Caldwell, I don't wish to impose on your hospitality, but my employers are anxious to resolve this matter of the missing documents." He set down his fork, all pretense of casual dining abandoned. "I must insist on seeing the girl now." Nate sipped his coffee, deliberately unhurried, his mind racing through the plan. Elizabeth was miles away by now, riding hard for Eagle Pass, but Langley couldn't know that, not yet. "What exactly are these documents you keep mentioning?" he asked, his tone mild but probing. Langley's smile was a thin veneer over cold calculation. "Ledgers, financial records, internal matters of no interest to anyone but our accountants. But they are valuable to the company, and we'd prefer they not fall into the wrong hands." "Valuable enough to send 3 armed men after a child," Nate countered, his eyes locking onto Langley's. The room fell silent, Clara pausing mid-step as she cleared plates, the air thick with unspoken accusations. Langley's expression didn't change, but something predatory flickered in his gaze. "I'm afraid I don't follow, Mr. Caldwell. The wagon train was attacked by Indians, as I understand, a tragic loss." Nate set down his cup with deliberate precision, his voice low and dangerous. "Funny thing about Indian attacks. They don't usually search wagons like they're looking for buried treasure. They don't question folks before killing 'em. And they sure as hell don't wear Navajo silver bracelets stolen from murdered ranchers' families 7 years ago." Kane stiffened, his hand dropping below the table, no doubt resting on a concealed weapon. Nate's pulse quickened, but he kept his gaze steady, every muscle coiled for action. "Mr. Caldwell," Langley said, his voice icy, "I came here in good faith to retrieve company property and a witness to a corporate matter. If you're implying something more sinister, I suggest you consider your position. You're one man on an isolated ranch." Nate's lips curved in a humorless smile. "Am I?" As if on cue, a rifle shot cracked the air outside, Hayes's signal that Tommy had returned, hopefully with Lieutenant Carter's cavalry. The sound was perfectly timed, causing Langley, Kane, and Travers to tense, their hands twitching toward weapons. Langley recovered first, his smooth facade returning, though his eyes remained cold. "What was that?" he asked, his voice deceptively calm. "Likely just one of my hands clearing varmints from the grain shed," Nate replied, rising slowly from his chair, his hand near his Colt. "If you'll excuse me, I should check." "Sit down, Caldwell," Kane growled, drawing his revolver and aiming it across the table, the Navajo bracelet glinting in the sunlight. "No one's going anywhere till we see the girl and get those documents." Clara gasped, backing against the sideboard, her hand clutching a serving spoon like a weapon. Nate remained standing, his expression unchanged despite the gun pointed at his chest. "Caleb Blackwell," he said quietly, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Thought I recognized you, scar or no. You've aged poorly since you and your brother Silas murdered my wife and daughter." Kane or Blackwell bared his teeth in a savage grin. "Wondered if you'd make the connection, Caldwell. Silas sends his regards, by the way." Langley shot an irritated glance at his companion. "This ain't the time for personal grudges, Mr. Kane. We have business to settle." He turned to Nate, his own revolver now resting on the table beside his coffee cup. "The girl and the documents, Caldwell. Now, or this ends badly for everyone in this house." Nate weighed his options, his mind racing. Tommy's return likely meant Carter's men were securing the perimeter, but Langley and his companions were armed and inside the house. One wrong move could turn the dining room into a slaughterhouse. "The girl ain't here," he said finally, watching Blackwell's trigger finger for any telltale tension. Langley's expression hardened, his polished mask slipping. "I don't believe you." Nate held his gaze unflinching. "She left before dawn, along with the documents you're so keen to get back. By now she's well beyond your reach." "You're lying," Blackwell snarled, rising halfway from his chair, gun still trained on Nate. "Am I?" Nate countered, his voice calm but edged with defiance. "Check the house. You won't find her." Langley studied him for a long moment, then nodded to Travers. "Search the premises." "Thoroughly." As Travers rose, Nate added, a calculated bluff. "You should know, copies of those documents are already on their way to federal authorities in 3 different cities. Whatever scheme you're protecting, it's already coming apart." Langley's composure cracked, a flush of anger coloring his pale cheeks. "You have no idea what you've stepped into, Caldwell," he hissed. "This goes beyond a few ledger entries or land deeds. Men far more powerful than you have staked everything on this, men like Senator Grayson and Judge Harlan." Nate's eyes narrowed, recognizing the names from Elizabeth's documents, a confirmation of the corruption's reach into the territory's highest echelons. Before he could press further, a shout from upstairs signaled Travers's return, his heavy footsteps pounding down the stairs. "She ain't here," Travers reported, breathing heavily. "Checked every room, closets, under beds, nothing." Langley slammed his fist on the table, rattling the china, his cultured veneer shattering. "Where is she?" he demanded, his voice a raw snarl. "Where'd you send her?" Nate's smile was cold, unyielding. "Somewhere you'll never find her." "It's over, Langley. Your fraud, your murders, it all comes to light now." Blackwell laughed, an ugly sound devoid of humor. "You think this ends with us? The railroad's got men in every town from here to St. Louis. That girl won't see another sunrise once word gets out." Nate's voice was ice. "That assumes you'll be sending any word." As if punctuating his words, the front door burst open, and Lieutenant Samuel Carter entered, flanked by 4 armed soldiers, their carbines raised and ready. The reinforcements Tommy had brought from Fort Benton moved with practiced efficiency, their presence shifting the balance in the room. "Edward Langley," Carter announced, his young face stern with authority, "you and your companions are under arrest by order of the United States Army on suspicion of conspiracy, fraud, and murder." For a crucial moment, the room teetered on the edge of violence. Blackwell's gun remained aimed at Nate, his scarred face twisted with calculation. Langley's hand hovered near his revolver, and Travers, caught between the soldiers and Nate, hesitated, his eyes darting for an escape. Then chaos erupted. Blackwell shifted his aim toward Carter, deciding the military threat took precedence. Langley lunged for his revolver, but Nate, whose reflexes had once made him a legend in the territory, moved faster. His Colt appeared in his hand as if by magic, clearing its holster and firing in one fluid motion. The bullet struck Blackwell's shoulder, spinning him away from Carter and sending his shot wild into the ceiling. In the same motion, Nate's left hand swept the tablecloth upward, entangling Langley's fingers before they could grip his weapon. Travers, outnumbered and outmaneuvered, froze as 2 Army rifles trained on his chest, and Corporal Hayes entered through the kitchen, his carbine adding to the overwhelming firepower now commanding the room. "Weapons on the floor," Carter ordered, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Now or the next shot won't be aimed to wound." Blackwell, white-faced with pain, slowly lowered his revolver with his uninjured hand. Langley, still caught in the tablecloth, glared at Nate with undisguised hatred, but released his grip on his weapon. Travers, seeing no way out, placed his gun on the carpet, his hands raised in surrender. "Secure them," Carter instructed, his men moving to bind the prisoners. "Hayes, see to Kane's wound. Enough to stop the bleeding, but don't waste sympathy. These men are responsible for 17 deaths, maybe more." As the soldiers worked, Carter turned to Nate, an eyebrow raised in professional respect. "Impressive shooting, Mr. Caldwell. Glad those stories about your speed weren't just saloon talk." Nate holstered his Colt, the familiar weight settling against his hip like an old friend. "Been a while," he admitted, a wry edge to his voice. "Wasn't sure I still had it." Carter lowered his voice, glancing at the prisoners. "Where's the girl?" Nate kept his expression neutral. "Headed north with Jim and Private Ellis, through Eagle Pass to Fort Ellis. She's got documents implicating these men and others: fraud, land theft, bribery of officials." Carter nodded, his face grim. "Colonel Ramsey's been investigating corruption in the territorial government for months. This could break the case wide open." He hesitated, then added, "Smart move sending her north. We found out this morning the telegraph lines to Fort Benton were cut yesterday. Someone inside the fort's been feeding information to Langley's people." The confirmation of such widespread corruption sent a chill through Nate. Elizabeth was still in grave danger, her safety hinging on Jim and Ellis reaching Fort Ellis before the conspirators' network closed in. "I need to go after him," Nate said, his decision made. "Make sure they get to Marshal Tate safely." Carter nodded, understanding the stakes. "I can spare 2 men to go with you, Sergeant Walsh and Private Morgan. The rest of us will take these prisoners to Fort Benton under heavy guard. Colonel Ramsey will want to question M personally before they are shipped to federal custody." As arrangements were made, Clara approached, her composure restored despite the chaos. "I'll pack provisions for your ride," she said, already mentally listing supplies. "And I'll have Sammy fetch your mount and gear from storage." Nate nodded, his thoughts turning to the treacherous trail through Eagle Pass. He didn't voice his growing fear that Langley's confidence hinted at resources beyond what they'd seen, a network that could reach Elizabeth even in the mountains. Clara paused, her voice softening. "That shot you made, Nate, Laura would have been proud. She always said you were at your best protecting others." The words struck deeper than Nate expected, a reminder of the man he'd been before grief had hollowed him out. "I wasn't there when it mattered most," he said quietly, the old guilt surfacing. Clara's eyes met his, steady and sure. "You're here now. That girl needs you. Don't waste time on what can't be changed." Outside, as the soldiers loaded the prisoners into a wagon for transport, Nate stood on the porch, watching the sun begin its westward journey. Somewhere in the mountains, Elizabeth was riding toward what he hoped was safety, carrying documents that could topple a corrupt empire. 7 years ago, he'd failed to protect his family. Today, he had a chance to use his skills, not for vengeance, but for justice, for a girl who'd given him a reason to live again. "Get my horse ready," he called to Sammy. "We ride in 20 minutes. The chase through Eagle Pass." Eagle Pass, Montana Territory, April 1876. The rugged peaks of Eagle Pass loomed against a sky streaked with the last embers of dusk, their snow-capped summits glowing faintly under the emerging stars. Nathaniel Nate, Caldwell urged his mare, Daisy, up the steep, rocky trail, the clatter of hooves echoing off the pine-shrouded cliffs. The air was sharp with the bite of late spring frost, carrying the scent of damp earth and resin, a stark reminder of the unforgiving wilderness that separated Caldwell Ranch from Fort Ellis. Behind him, Sergeant Daniel Walsh and Private Henry Morgan, the 2 soldiers Lieutenant Samuel Carter had assigned, struggled to keep pace, their horses snorting with exertion as they navigated the treacherous path. Nate's breath formed clouds in the chill, but his focus was razor-sharp, driven by the need to reach Elizabeth, Jim Donovan, and Private Ellis before the conspirators' network closed in. They'd been riding for 6 hours. Following the northern trail Jim would have taken through the dense forests and narrow defiles of Eagle Pass. Nate knew this country like the lines on his weathered hands, every ridge, every hidden spring, every ambush point where a man could lie in wait. He'd hunted these mountains for 15 years, first with his father, then with Laura and Emily, teaching his daughter to track deer and read the land. Now, those skills were all that stood between Elizabeth and the men who'd slaughtered an entire wagon train to silence her. The documents she carried, ledgers, deeds, a list of names implicating the Pacific Northern Railroad's elite, were a death warrant, and Nate's gut told him the danger was closer than they'd hoped. "Need to rest the horses soon, Mr. Caldwell," Sergeant Walsh called, his voice rough from the dust of the trail. A grizzled veteran of 40, Walsh had the steady demeanor of a man who'd seen too many battles to flinch at one more. "They won't make the high pass if we don't water 'em." Nate knew he was right. Daisy's flanks were lathered, her breathing labored, but every instinct screamed to push forward. Edward Langley's chilling confidence, the Navajo silver bracelet on Caleb Blackwell's wrist, and the cut telegraph lines at Fort Benton all pointed to a conspiracy with tendrils far beyond Silver Creek Valley. "There's a creek half a mile up," Nate conceded, his voice tight. "We stopped there, but only long enough to keep the horses sound." As they rounded a bend in the trail, Nate reined in sharply, his hand dropping to the colt at his hip. Fresh hoofprints marked the muddy ground beside a fallen log, at least 5 horses, moving at speed, their tracks crossing the path and veering northeast toward a shortcut that would intercept the main trail through Eagle Pass. "Those ain't Jim's," Walsh observed, dismounting to examine the prints, his weathered face grim. "Too many horses, and look here, military-issue horseshoes." Private Morgan, a lanky 20-year-old with a nervous energy, frowned. "Army patrol, maybe." "Not from Fort Benton," Walsh replied, his eyes meeting Nate's. Carter would have mentioned it. Nate's stomach churned, a cold certainty settling in. "Unless they ain't under his command." Langley said they had men at the fort. If word got out about his arrest, he didn't need to finish the thought. The implications were clear. Someone had sent riders to cut off Jim, Ellis, and Elizabeth before they could reach Fort Ellis. "We need to head him off," Nate said, studying the terrain ahead. "There's an old trapper's trail 2 miles up, crosses over to Sentinel Ridge. It's rough, but it might get us to the pass before M." "That's brutal country," Walsh warned, adjusting his kepi. "Barely passable this time of year, especially with the snowmelt." Nate's jaw tightened, his resolve unyielding. "It's passable enough. I've hunted these trails since I was a boy. We move fast, we can beat 'em to the pinch." The detour proved as punishing as Walsh predicted. Twice they had to dismount, leading the horses over slick rock slides where a single misstep could send man and beast tumbling into the ravine below. A fallen pine blocked their path at one point, forcing them to hack through dense underbrush with hatchets, each delay gnawing at Nate's patience. The memory of Elizabeth's fierce hug, her scribbled note, "Thank you for risking everything," drove him forward, a reminder of the stakes riding on their success. By late afternoon, they reached Sentinel Ridge, a windswept plateau that offered a commanding view of Eagle Pass below. Nate raised his field glasses, scanning the twisting trail that snaked through the valley, his heart pounding with a mix of hope and dread. "There," he said suddenly, adjusting the focus. 4 miles south, Jim's party. Walsh took the glasses, confirming the sighting. 3 riders moving steady. "They are macking good time." Nate pointed to a closer section of the trail, near the pass's narrowest point. And there, 5 riders moving fast. They'll cut Jim's group off before they reach the pinch. Calculations raced through Nate's mind. Distances, terrain, time. We can't reach him before the interception, he concluded, his voice grim. But we can set up above the pass, give him cover and fire when they come through. Walsh's expression was sober, but he nodded. If they make it that far. Nate's eyes hardened, his voice low and certain. They'll make it. Jim won't let him take her without a fight, and Ellis is army trained. As they urged their mounts down the ridge toward the pass, Nate pushed aside the odds. 5 armed men, likely military, against a foreman, a soldier, and a traumatized girl. He focused instead on the wooden sparrow Elizabeth had pressed into his hand, a talisman now tucked in his coat pocket, a promise to find her. They reached a defensible position above the pass's narrowest section, just as the sun dipped behind the western peaks, painting the sky in hues of crimson and indigo. Walsh and Morgan established firing positions behind massive boulders, their carbines at the ready, while Nate scouted the approaches, his senses attuned to every sound, the rustle of pine needles, the distant cry of a hawk. The first sign of trouble came not as a visual but as a sound. Gunfire, faint but unmistakable, echoing off the mountain walls. 3 shots in rapid succession, a pause, then 2 more. That's a Springfield carbine, Walsh identified, his voice tense. Army issue. Nate's jaw clenched, the confirmation that their pursuers were military, or at least armed with military weapons, only sharpening his resolve. Minutes stretched into an agonizing half-hour, the shadows lengthening across the pass, until movement on the southern approach caught his eye. A single rider, pushing a lathered horse at a reckless pace through the rocky terrain. It's the girl, Nate said, recognizing Elizabeth's slender form, even in her boy's disguise. She was alone, her hat gone, her hair streaming behind her as she clung to her mount with desperate strength. Blood stained the left sleeve of her coat, though whether it was hers or someone else's was impossible to tell at this distance. Morgan, go down and guide her up, Nate ordered, his eyes never leaving the trail behind her. Walsh, be ready to cover if her pursuers show. Morgan scrambled down the slope, moving with careful speed over the loose rock, reaching the trail just as Elizabeth's exhausted horse stumbled to a walk, the girl swaying dangerously in the saddle. From his elevated position, Nate saw the moment she spotted Morgan's uniform, her posture stiffening with panic, her hands fumbling for the reins to urge her mount away. She thinks he's with them, Nate realized aloud, his heart lurching. Without hesitation, he stood from cover, his voice carrying across the mountain air. Elizabeth. It's Nate Caldwell. The soldier's with me. Her head snapped up, searching the ridge until she spotted him, the relief in her posture visible even from afar. She allowed Morgan to take her horse's reins, guiding her up the steep path to their position. As they reached the top, Nate saw her condition up close. A bullet grazed across her upper left shoulder, blood seeping through the torn fabric, scratches crisscrossing her face from branches she'd ridden through at speed, and an exhaustion that left her pale and trembling. But her eyes burned with a fierce determination, the same resilience that had carried her through the wagon train massacre. Jim, she gasped as Nate helped her from the saddle, her voice raspy from disuse but clear. Ellis, save your strength, Nate said, guiding her to shelter behind the largest boulder, his tone gentle but firm. We'll talk when you're safer. Walsh handed her a canteen, which she drank from gratefully, while Nate examined her wound, his hands steady despite the storm of worry in his chest. Movement on the trail below snapped his attention back to the pass. Riders common, Walsh warned, raising his carbine. 5 horsemen appeared, moving at a controlled trot, their army uniforms stark against the rocky terrain, though their formation lacked the discipline of a proper patrol. "Hold fire," Nate said, his voice low. "Let's see what they are about." The riders slowed as they reached the spot where Morgan had intercepted Elizabeth, the leader, a heavy-set man with sergeant's stripes, pointing toward the ridge, clearly having spotted their movement. "That ain't a regular patrol," Walsh muttered, his eyes narrowing. "I know every sergeant at Fort Benton, and he ain't one of 'em." As if confirming their suspicions, the leader gave a hand signal, and his men spread out in an attack formation, one raising a rifle toward the ridge. "Down!" Nate shouted, pulling Elizabeth deeper behind the boulder as a shot cracked the air, the bullet striking rock above their heads, sending shards flying. Walsh returned fire, his shot striking one attacker in the shoulder, knocking him from his horse. Morgan followed suit, the two soldiers establishing a coordinated defense that pinned the attackers at the base of the ridge. "They're trying to flank us from the east," Nate observed, noting two riders breaking away from the main group. He raised his Winchester, leading the first rider slightly, and fired. The man tumbled from his saddle, while his companion retreated to the trail's cover. The firefight raged for several tense minutes, neither side gaining a decisive edge. The attackers had cover behind rocky outcrops, while Nate's group held the high ground, their position a natural fortress. During a lull, Elizabeth tugged at Nate's sleeve, pressing a folded paper into his hand, her eyes conveying urgency. He opened it, reading her hastily scrawled words. Jim and Ellis stayed behind at a narrow canyon to hold them off. "Jim was hit but told me to ride. Said you'd find me." Nate's expression darkened, the news of Jim's wound, perhaps fatal, hitting like a physical blow. Jim Donovan had been more than a foreman. He'd been a friend, one of the few Nate had let close after losing Laura and Emily. "How many were after you?" he asked, his voice steady despite the grief clawing at him. Elizabeth held up 8 fingers, then pointed to the trail where only 5 attackers remained. 3 unaccounted for, Nate told Walsh, his mind racing. "Could be circling around to hit us from behind." Walsh nodded, his weathered face resolute. "Morgan and I can hold this spot. You need to get the girl to Fort Ellis." Nate shook his head, his voice firm. "Ain't leaving you outnumbered." Walsh's eyes met his, unyielding. "With respect, sir, that girl and those documents are more important than any of us. Army trained us for this. If we don't hear from you in 3 days, Carter'll send reinforcements." Before Nate could argue, movement in the pass below drew their attention. A single rider approached from the south, not one of the attackers but a familiar figure slumped in the saddle, barely clinging to life. "That's Ellis," Morgan exclaimed, his voice thick with relief and worry. The young private's uniform was dark with blood, one arm hanging uselessly at his side, his face contorted with pain. The attackers spotted him too, 2 breaking cover to intercept. "Cover me," Nate ordered, already moving down the slope, using boulders for protection as Walsh and Morgan opened fire, forcing the attackers back. Nate reached Ellis just as the soldier nearly fell from his horse, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Mr. Caldwell," he choked out, "the girl, she's safe." "She's safe," Nate assured him, supporting Ellis's weight as he guided the horse toward the ridge. "Where's Jim?" Ellis's face twisted with grief. "Didn't make it, sir. Took 3 of them with him, fought like a lion to give us time." The news struck Nate like a hammer, the loss of Jim Donovan adding a new weight to his shoulders. He'd lost too many to the Blackwells and their kind, and each loss carved deeper into his soul. With Walsh and Morgan providing cover, Nate got Ellis to the ridge, where Elizabeth tore strips from her shirt to bind his wounds, her small hands working with surprising skill. "Can't stay here," Ellis warned through gritted teeth. "Those 3 missing riders, They rode ahead to set an ambush at Granite Narrows, the only pass across the river to Fort Ellis. Nate studied their options, the encroaching darkness both a shield and a threat. Traveling mountain trails at night risked disaster, but staying put meant certain discovery come dawn. There's another way, he decided, his voice firm. An old trapper's route along the western ridgeline. It's dangerous, especially in the dark, but it bypasses Granite Narrows. You can't take the girl that way, Walsh objected, his tone urgent. One slip and I ain't tacking her, Nate cut in, his mind made up. You and Morgan will. Ellis needs a doc, and Elizabeth needs to get those documents to Marshal Tate. He nodded toward the satchel still clutched at her side. And you, sir? Morgan asked, his young face betraying his suspicion of the answer. I'll create a diversion, Nate said, his tone leaving no room for debate. Make him think we're all heading east toward Granite Narrows. Once they commit, you take the western route. I'll catch up when I can. Elizabeth shook her head vehemently, scribbling rapidly. Too dangerous. They'll kill you. Her eyes blazed with a stubborn fire, a refusal to accept another sacrifice on her behalf. They can try, Nate replied, his voice grim but confident. I know these mountains better than any of them, and I've got scores to settle with men wearing that silver bracelet. Despite her exhaustion, Elizabeth's resolve didn't waver. She wrote again, I won't leave you behind. Not after Jim. The words struck Nate with a force that echoed Emily's fierce loyalty, the same heart that had defined his daughter. It ain't your call, he said gently, his hand resting briefly on her shoulder. This is what Jim would want, what I want. He turned to Walsh, outlining the plan in precise detail, how he'd lay a false trail east, using campfires and broken branches to draw the pursuers, how Walsh and Morgan should navigate the western route, using the night's cover to slip past any scouts. As the soldiers prepared the horses for the perilous journey, Nate found himself alone with Elizabeth for a moment, her gaze piercing through his defenses, seeing the man he'd once been, a protector, a father. I'll find you in Fort Ellis, he promised, his voice steady. Elizabeth hesitated, then reached up, untying a small wooden sparrow that hung on a cord around her neck. She pressed it into his hand, closing his fingers around it, a gesture that needed no words, a vow to reunite. Nate nodded, tucking the sparrow into his pocket, its weight a quiet anchor against the darkness ahead. As he helped her mount behind Walsh, she leaned down and spoke, her voice a raspy whisper, the first word she'd uttered since the pass. Find me. The simple phrase carried the weight of a sacred oath. Nate nodded, the sparrow clutched tightly in his hand. Count on it. He watched them depart, 4 figures fading into the mountain's embrace, the night swallowing them whole. Only when they were gone did he turn to his task, laying false trails and setting traps with a clarity of purpose he hadn't known in 7 years. The grief that had defined him since Laura and Emily's deaths hadn't vanished, but it had shifted, becoming a foundation for something new, a chance to protect, to fight, to honor the man he'd once been. Fire in the Pass, the stand at Eagle Pass. Eagle Pass, Montana Territory, April 1876. The night cloaked Eagle Pass in a shroud of ink and shadow, the jagged peaks of the Bitterroot Mountains standing as silent sentinels under a sky pricked with stars. Nathaniel Nate Caldwell moved alone through the rocky terrain, his boots crunching softly on the frost-kissed gravel, his breath forming fleeting clouds in the frigid air. The wooden sparrow Elizabeth had given him rested in his coat pocket, a small weight that anchored him against the chaos he was about to unleash. Somewhere to the west, Sergeant Daniel Walsh and Private Henry Morgan were guiding Elizabeth and the wounded Private Ellis along the treacherous trapper's route, their path to Fort Ellis a desperate bid for safety. Nate's job was simpler but no less deadly: to draw the pursuers east toward Granite Narrows, buying time for Elizabeth to escape with the documents that could dismantle a corrupt empire. The firefight at the pass had left 5 attackers pinned below, but 3 others, unaccounted for, likely circling to set an ambush at Granite Narrows, posed a threat Nate couldn't ignore. He worked with the precision of a man who'd once led cavalry raids, laying a false trail to mislead the enemy. He broke branches at irregular intervals, scuffed boot prints in the mud, and set a small campfire just visible from the main trail, its glow a deliberate beacon. Each trap was calculated, a taunt to draw the pursuers away from the western ridgeline where Elizabeth's party traveled. Nate's Colt hung heavy at his hip, his Winchester slung across his back, but his greatest weapon was the land itself. Eagle Pass, with its hidden ravines and choke points, was as familiar to him as the lines of grief etched into his face. As he rigged a tripwire across a narrow defile, tying it to a stack of loose rocks that would tumble with a clatter, Nate's thoughts drifted to a memory from his cavalry days. In '63, during a skirmish in Tennessee, he'd led a diversion to draw Confederate scouts away from a Union supply train, using campfires and false tracks to lure them into an ambush. The tactic had saved lives then, but it had cost him 3 men, friends whose faces still haunted his dreams. Tonight he was alone, and the stakes were higher: Elizabeth's life, the evidence of railroad corruption, and the chance to honor Jim Donovan's sacrifice. The foreman's death in the canyon, fighting to give Elizabeth time, burned in Nate's chest, a fire that fueled his resolve. The first sign of pursuit came as a distant clatter of hooves, faint but unmistakable, echoing from the eastern trail. Nate crouched behind a boulder, his field glasses catching the glint of moonlight on metal. 3 riders, moving cautiously, their silhouettes marked by the telltale slump of military saddles. They weren't the main group from the pass, but the missing 3, likely scouts sent to Granite Narrows for the ambush Ellis had warned about. Nate's trap had worked. The campfire had drawn them off course, but now he had to keep them chasing, leading them deeper into the maze of ravines where he could control the fight. He slipped from cover, deliberately snapping a twig to draw their attention, then moved swiftly toward a choke point he'd scouted earlier, a narrow ledge flanked by sheer cliffs, where a single man could hold off a dozen. The riders took the bait, their horses picking up speed, their voices carrying in the still night. "Tracks head this way," one growled, his accent thick with the drawl of the deep south. "He's alone, can't be far." Nate's lips curved in a grim smile. Alone but not helpless. He reached the ledge, positioning himself behind a jutting rock, his Winchester ready. The riders slowed as they approached, sensing the trap, but it was too late. Nate fired a single shot, the bullet grazing the shoulder of the lead rider, who cursed and reined in his horse, blood blooming dark against his uniform. "Spread out," the leader barked, but the narrow ledge left little room to maneuver. Nate fired again, this time aiming for the ground near the second rider's horse, spooking it into rearing. The chaos gave him the edge he needed, but he knew it wouldn't last. These men were trained, likely deserters or mercenaries hired by the railroad, and they'd regroup quickly. He retreated deeper into the ravine, leading them away from the western trail, his movements silent and deliberate, a ghost in his own mountains. Meanwhile, on the western ridgeline, Elizabeth clung to the back of Sergeant Walsh's horse, her arms wrapped tightly around his waist, the satchel of documents pressed against her chest. The trapper's route was a nightmare of loose shale and overhanging pines, the trail barely wide enough for a single horse. Private Morgan rode ahead, guiding the wounded Ellis, whose labored breathing was a constant reminder of the cost of their escape. The night was their ally, cloaking them in darkness, but it also hid dangers: A misstep could send them plunging into the abyss below. Elizabeth's shoulder throbbed where the bullet had grazed her, but she bit back the pain, her mind fixed on Nate's promise. "I'll find you in Fort Ellis." Walsh's voice broke the silence, low and steady. "We're macking good time, miss. Trail opens up in a mile, then it's a straight shot to the river." Elizabeth nodded against his back, unable to speak, her throat tight with fear and gratitude. She thought of Jim Donovan, his gruff kindness as he'd adjusted her stirrups, his final shout to ride as he faced the attackers alone. She thought of Nate standing on the ridge, his voice cutting through her panic, a beacon in the chaos. The wooden sparrow was gone, given to him as a talisman, but its absence felt like a promise, a thread connecting her to the man who'd risked everything for her. Morgan called back, his voice tense. "Rider ahead, single horse, moving slow." Walsh reined in, his hand dropping to his carbine, but Elizabeth's sharp intake of breath stopped him. She pointed to the rider's silhouette, barely visible in the moonlight, a slump that matched Ellis's, a horse she recognized. "It's one of ours," she whispered, her voice raspy but certain. Morgan approached cautiously, his carbine raised, then lowered it with a relieved curse. "It's Corporal Hayes from the ranch." Hayes, dispatched by Lieutenant Carter to reinforce Nate's group, was battered but alive, his horse lathered from a hard ride. "Caldwell sent me to find you," he gasped, his face pale in the moonlight. "He's holding off the scouts east of the pass, but there's more common, at least 4 from the main group, breaking off to circle west." Walsh's expression darkened. "They're trying to cut us off at the river." Elizabeth's heart sank, the weight of her documents heavier than ever. "They'll never stop," she thought, her resolve hardening. But neither will I. Back in the ravine, Nate's diversion had turned into a deadly game of cat and mouse. The 3 riders had dismounted, fanning out to flank him, their movements disciplined but not flawless. Nate used the terrain to his advantage, slipping between boulders and doubling back to trigger his tripwire, sending a cascade of rocks crashing down behind the second rider. The man shouted, pinned briefly under the debris, giving Nate time to reposition. But the leader was smarter, anticipating Nate's tactics, and a bullet whizzed past his head, close enough to stir his hair. Nate's mind flashed to a moment 7 years ago, tracking the Blackwell gang through a Wyoming canyon, his rage a blinding force that had cost him 2 companions. He'd learned since then, tempered by loss, and now his movements were cold, precise. He fired again, this time hitting the 3rd rider in the leg, sending him sprawling with a cry. But the leader closed in, his revolver barking, and Nate felt a searing pain across his forearm as a bullet grazed him. He ducked behind a pine, his breath ragged, and checked the wound, shallow, but bleeding enough to slow him if he didn't end this soon. The leader's voice rang out, taunting. "You can't run forever, Caldwell. Give us the girl and you walk away." Nate's laugh was low, bitter, as he reloaded his Winchester. "You ain't getting her, and you ain't walking away neither." He stepped into the open, firing twice in rapid succession, the first shot missing but the second catching the leader in the shoulder, forcing him to drop his gun. The pinned rider was still struggling, and the 3rd was out of the fight, leaving Nate a narrow window to retreat. But as he moved, a new sound froze him, hooves heavy and fast approaching from the east. The main group from the pass, or a portion of it, had caught up, drawn by the gunfire. Nate's heart sank, but his resolve didn't waver. He lit a small bundle of dry brush, tossing it into a pile of kindling he'd prepared earlier, creating a wall of smoke to obscure his escape. The flames wouldn't last long, but they'd buy him time to slip into a side ravine, leading the pursuers further from Elizabeth's trail. On the western ridgeline, Walsh's group reached the river, its waters glinting silver under the moon. The trail widened here, offering a clearer path to Fort Ellis, but Hayes's warning of additional pursuers kept them on edge. Elizabeth, her shoulder now bandaged with strips from Morgan's shirt, rode behind Walsh, her eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of pursuit. The satchel felt heavier with each mile, its contents a burden she'd never asked for but couldn't abandon. She thought of her brother Benjamin, killed in a staged robbery to silence his questions about the railroad, of the Thorntons, who died protecting her, of Jim, whose sacrifice had given her this chance, and of Nate out there alone, fighting to keep her alive. "We're close," Walsh said, his voice a low rumble. "Fort Ellis is 10 miles, maybe less. We'll make it by dawn if we keep this pace." Elizabeth nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She clutched the reins, her mind replaying Nate's promise, "Count on it." As they crossed the river, the sound of distant gunfire reached them, faint but unmistakable, echoing from the east. Elizabeth's heart lurched, knowing it was Nate, drawing the enemy away. She whispered a prayer, not to any god but to the man who'd become her protector. "Find me." Nate emerged from the side ravine, his arm throbbing but his focus unbroken. The smoke from his fire had confused the pursuers, their shouts growing fainter as they spread out to search. He'd bought Elizabeth time, but the cost was mounting. His ammunition was low, his wounds slowing him, and the main group was closing in. He reached a high vantage point, crouching to scan the pass below. The original 5 attackers from the firefight were regrouping, joined by 2 more from the east, their numbers now overwhelming. Nate's traps had thinned their ranks, but not enough. A memory surfaced, unbidden. Laura, sitting on the porch of Caldwell Ranch, her voice soft as she read to Emily under the stars. "A man's only as good as the promises he keeps," she'd said, quoting her father. Nate had promised to find Elizabeth, and he'd be damned if he broke that vow. He checked his Colt, 6 rounds left, and his Winchester, 4. Enough to make a stand if it came to that. But as he prepared to move, a new sound reached him. A low rumble, not hooves but the clatter of a wagon, approaching from the north. His heart leapt with a fragile hope. Lieutenant Carter, perhaps, or reinforcements from Fort Ellis. He raised his field glasses, straining to see through the darkness. The wagon bore army markings, flanked by 4 riders, soldiers, their uniforms unmistakable. But something was off. Their formation was sloppy, their pace too deliberate, like hunters stalking prey. Nate's hope curdled into suspicion. These weren't Carter's men. They were part of the railroad's network, deserters or bribed soldiers sent to finish the job. The realization hit him like a bullet. Elizabeth's trail wasn't safe, not yet. He had to keep fighting, keep them distracted, until she reached Marshall Tate. Nate lit another fire, smaller this time, and fired a single shot into the air, the crack echoing through the pass. The riders below reacted instantly, converging on his position, their shouts carrying in the night. He slipped into the shadows, moving west now, toward the river, his plan shifting with the desperate clarity of a man with nothing left to lose. If he could draw them all east, away from the western trail, Elizabeth might have a chance. The sparrow in his pocket felt heavier, a reminder of the girl who'd given him a reason to fight, to live, to be the man Laura had loved and Emily had adored. As he vanished into the night, the flames of his diversion burned bright, a beacon of defiance in the heart of Eagle Pass. Sanctuary and sacrifice, the road to Fort Ellis. Fort Ellis, Montana Territory, April 1876. The first light of dawn crept over the rolling hills surrounding Fort Ellis, painting the wooden palisades and squat barracks in hues of gold and amber. Elizabeth clung to the back of Sergeant Daniel Walsh's horse, her arms wrapped tightly around his waist, the satchel of damning documents pressed against her chest like a shield. The trapper's route had been a grueling ordeal, narrow trails slick with snowmelt, overhanging pines that clawed at her face, and the constant fear of pursuit. But they'd made it, the fort's gates looming ahead like a promise kept. Private Henry Morgan rode beside them, leading the wounded Private Ellis, whose labored breathing had grown fainter with each mile. Corporal Hayes, who joined them on the western ridgeline, brought up the rear, his carbine ready, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of the railroad's mercenaries. Elizabeth's shoulder throbbed where the bullet had grazed her, the makeshift bandage Morgan had applied now stiff with dried blood. Her body ached from the relentless ride, but her mind was sharp, fueled by the hope of reaching Federal Marshal Jeremiah Tate and the fear for Nathaniel Nate Caldwell, still out there in Eagle Pass, drawing the enemy away. The distant gunfire they'd heard hours ago, sharp cracks echoing from the east, had faded into silence, leaving a void that gnawed at her heart. Nate's promise, "I'll find you in Fort Ellis," was the thread she clung to, the wooden sparrow she'd given him, a talisman she prayed would bring him back. Walsh reined in his horse as they approached the fort's gates, 2 sentries snapping to attention, their rifles raised. "Sergeant Walsh, 5th Cavalry from Fort Benton," he called, his voice steady despite the exhaustion etched into his weathered face. "We've got a wounded man and a civilian with urgent business for Marshal Tate." The sentries exchanged glances, then one waved them through, the heavy gates creaking open to reveal a bustling courtyard. Soldiers drilled in the early light, their boots pounding the dirt in rhythmic cadence, while a blacksmith's hammer rang out from a nearby forge, the air thick with the scent of wood smoke and horse sweat. Elizabeth's eyes darted across the scene, taking in the orderly chaos of frontier military life. Officers barking orders, a wagon unloading crates of supplies, a group of women washing laundry by a well. It was a world apart from the blood-soaked horror of the wagon train, yet the sight of so many uniforms stirred a flicker of fear, a reminder of the corrupt soldiers who'd hunted her. Walsh dismounted, helping her down with a gentleness that belied his gruff exterior. "You're safe now, miss," he said, his voice low. "Tate's a good man. He'll know what to do with those papers." She nodded, her throat too tight to speak, and clutched the satchel closer, its weight a testament to the lives lost, her brother Benjamin, the Thorntons, Jim Donovan. Morgan supported Ellis, who was barely conscious, his face ashen as they moved toward the infirmary, a low building with whitewashed walls and a red cross painted above the door. Hayes stayed with the horses, his vigilant gaze never wavering. An officer approached, his captain's bars glinting on his shoulders, his face lined with the weariness of command. "Sergeant Walsh," he greeted, his tone clipped. "What's this about a civilian and a marshal?" "Miss Elizabeth here's got evidence of railroad corruption," Walsh explained, gesturing to her satchel. "Needs to see Marshal Tate, urgent. We've got pursuers on our tail, deserters, maybe, workin' for the Pacific Northern." The captain's eyes narrowed, flicking to Elizabeth, then to the satchel. "Tate's in the commandant's office. Follow me." As they crossed the courtyard, Elizabeth's heart pounded, the weight of her mission pressing harder with each step. She thought of Nate, alone in the mountains, his Colt flashing in the dark. "Find me," she'd whispered, and now, standing on the threshold of safety, she prayed he would. Eagle Pass, Montana Territory. In the heart of Eagle Pass, the night was a battlefield of smoke and steel, the air thick with the acrid tang of gunpowder and burning brush. Nate Caldwell crouched on a high ledge, his forearm bleeding where a bullet had grazed him, his Colt down to 3 rounds, his Winchester empty. The pursuers, 7 now, the remnants of the original group bolstered by the wagon's reinforcements, had spread out across the ravine below, their shouts and hoofbeats a relentless drumbeat of pursuit. Nate's diversion had worked too well, drawing their full attention, but it had trapped him in a deadly standoff, his traps and gunfire thinning their ranks but not enough to break their resolve. The flames from his last fire had died to embers, the smoke no longer enough to obscure his position. He'd led them deep into the eastern ravines, away from Elizabeth's trail, but the cost was mounting. His arm throbbed, slowing his movements, and the cold was seeping into his bones, a reminder of the Montana winters he'd endured as a younger man. Yet the wooden sparrow in his pocket burned against his chest, a vow to protect the girl who'd given him a reason to fight. A memory surfaced, sharp and vivid. Laura, sitting by the fire in their ranch house, her hazel eyes warm as she stitched a quilt for Emily's bed. "You're stubborn as a mule, Nate Caldwell," she'd teased, "but that's why I love you. You never give up on what matters." He hadn't given up then, building a life from the wilds of Silver Creek Valley. He wouldn't give up now. A shout from below snapped him back to the present. "Caldwell, show yourself, or we burn this whole damn pass." The voice belonged to the heavyset leader, the one with sergeant stripes, his drawl laced with fury. Nate's lips curved in a grim smile. "Burn it, and you'll never find me." He moved silently, slipping down a narrow path to a choke point he'd scouted earlier, a bottleneck where the ravine tightened, flanked by sheer cliffs. If he could hold them here, he could buy Elizabeth more time, maybe enough for Walsh to reach Fort Ellis. He rigged one final trap, a loose boulder balanced above the path, tied to a rope he could yank from cover. As the pursuers approached, their lanterns casting eerie shadows, Nate fired his Colt, the shot echoing like thunder. The bullet struck the ground near the leader's horse, spooking it into a rear, sowing chaos. He yanked the rope, and the boulder crashed down, blocking the path and forcing the riders to dismount, their curses filling the air. But the leader was quick, rallying his men, and a barrage of gunfire peppered the rocks around Nate, one bullet clipping his hat, another grazing his thigh. Nate gritted his teeth, the pain a white-hot flare, but he held his ground, firing his last 2 rounds to keep them pinned. The pursuers were closing in, their numbers overwhelming, and Nate knew this was his last stand. He thought of Elizabeth, her whispered "find me," and of Laura and Emily, whose deaths had defined him for 7 years. "I'm sorry I wasn't there," he thought, a silent apology to his lost family. "But I'm here now." As he prepared to draw his knife, a new sound reached him, a low, rhythmic thud, not hooves but boots, dozens of them, accompanied by the clatter of sabers and the barked orders of a military commander. From the north, a line of cavalry emerged, their blue uniforms stark against the dawn's first light, carbines raised and ready. Lieutenant Samuel Carter led them, his young face set with determination, flanked by 20 soldiers from Fort Benton. The pursuers froze, caught between Nate's choke point and the advancing cavalry, their resolve crumbling. "Drop your weapons," Carter shouted, his voice carrying the authority of a man half his age. "You're under arrest by order of the United States Army." The leader hesitated, his revolver still raised, but a single shot from Carter's carbine, aimed to wound, not kill, sent it clattering to the ground. The remaining pursuers, outnumbered and outmaneuvered, surrendered, their hands raised as the soldiers moved to secure them. Nate slumped against the rock, his strength ebbing, the pain in his arm and thigh a dull roar. Carter dismounted, his eyes scanning the ravine until they found Nate. "Mr. Caldwell," he called, a mix of relief and admiration in his voice. "You've got a hell of a knack for survival." Nate managed a weak smile, the wooden sparrow still clutched in his hand. "Told you I wasn't done yet," he rasped, his vision blurring as the adrenaline faded. Carter signaled for a medic, a young soldier who knelt beside Nate, bandaging his wounds with brisk efficiency. "The girl?" Nate asked, his voice urgent despite the haze of pain. Carter nodded, a rare smile breaking through his professional demeanor. Reached Fort Ellis an hour ago. She's with Marshal Tate, safe and sound. Those documents are already on their way to the federal prosecutor in Helena. Nate closed his eyes, relief washing over him like a warm tide. Elizabeth was safe, Jim's sacrifice honored, the railroad's corruption exposed. The medic finished his work, and Carter helped Nate to his feet, steadying him as they moved toward a waiting horse. "You're a stubborn bastard, Caldwell," Carter said, his tone almost fond. "But you saved that girl's life, and maybe the whole territory." Nate's grip tightened on the sparrow, Laura's words echoing in his mind. A man's only as good as the promises he keeps. He'd kept this one, and it was enough. Fort Ellis, Montana Territory. Inside the commandant's office, a Spartan room with a scarred oak desk and maps pinned to the walls, Elizabeth sat across from Federal Marshal Jeremiah Tate, a broad-shouldered man in his 50s with a salt-and-pepper beard and eyes that missed nothing. The satchel lay open before him, its contents, ledgers, deeds, the list of names, spread across the desk like a battle plan. Elizabeth's shoulder was properly bandaged now, her scratches cleaned, but the weight of her journey lingered in her solemn gaze. She told Tate everything, her work as a clerk at the railroad's western office, her discovery of the fraud, her brother's murder, the Thornton sacrifice, and Nate's relentless protection. Tate leaned back in his chair, his expression a mix of grim satisfaction and weary resolve. "These documents are dynamite, young lady," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Senator Grayson, Judge Harlan, half the territorial government. They'll be in irons by month's end, thanks to you." Elizabeth nodded, her hands clasped in her lap, but her thoughts were elsewhere, fixed on the man who'd made this moment possible. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, her voice stronger now, though still soft. "Is he?" Tate's eyes softened, a rare crack in his stern facade. Lieutenant Carter's men found him in Eagle Pass, holding off a small army. "He's banged up, bullet grazes, lost some blood, but he's tougher than a grizzly. They're bringing him here now." Elizabeth's breath caught, relief flooding her, but with it came a new fear. "Will they come after me again?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Tate shook his head, his hand resting on the documents. "Not after this. We've got enough here to dismantle their whole operation. You're under federal protection now, and I'll see to it personally that no one touches you." Walsh, standing by the door, cleared his throat. "Miss Elizabeth, you did good out there. Most grown men would have broken under what you've been through." Elizabeth managed a small smile, the first since leaving Caldwell Ranch. "Mr. Caldwell believed in me," she said simply. "And Jim. He gave his life for me." Tate nodded, his respect evident. "Donovan was a brave man. We'll make sure his name's honored, along with the Thorntons and your brother. As for Caldwell, I knew his wife's brother in the war. Good stock, that family. He's a man worth trusting." The door opened, and a young aide entered, saluting Tate. "Sir, message from Lieutenant Carter. They've secured the prisoners, and are en route with the wounded civilian. Should be here by noon." Tate dismissed the aide, then turned to Elizabeth. "Rest up, young lady. You've earned it. I'll have quarters prepared and we'll get you fed." Elizabeth nodded, but her eyes drifted to the window, where the hills stretched toward Eagle Pass. "Find me," she'd said, and Nate had promised he would. Now, as the sun climbed higher, she held on to that promise, a beacon in the storm of her young life. Silver Creek Valley, Montana Territory. The journey back to Fort Ellis was a blur of pain and determination for Nate, his wounds bandaged, but his strength pushed to its limits. Carter's cavalry rode in tight formation, the prisoners bound and guarded, their faces a mix of defiance and resignation. The leader, his shoulder wrapped from Nate's shot, glared at him from the wagon, but Nate's focus was elsewhere, fixed on the horizon where Fort Ellis waited. The wooden sparrow in his pocket was a quiet reminder of the girl who'd changed everything, pulling him from the shadows of his grief into a fight he hadn't known he could still wage. As they neared the fort, the gates opened and a small crowd gathered. Soldiers, officers, a few civilians, their faces curious and wary. Nate dismounted with Carter's help, his thigh and arm screaming in protest, but his eyes searched the courtyard until they found her. Elizabeth stood by the commandant's office, her shoulder bandaged, her boy's disguise replaced with a clean dress, her hair braided once more. When she saw him, her solemn face broke into a smile, unguarded and bright, and she ran toward him, heedless of the crowd. Nate caught her in a careful embrace, mindful of their wounds, the weight of her trust a balm to his battered soul. "You kept your promise," she said, her voice stronger now, no longer a whisper. Nate's throat tightened, Laura's words echoing in his mind. "Told you I would," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You're safe now, Elizabeth." She pulled back, her eyes searching his, and nodded, a silent understanding passing between them. The fight wasn't over, the trial, the conspirators' reach, the scars of their pasts, but for now they'd won this battle together. Carter approached, a telegram in hand. "From Marshal Tate," he said, handing it to Nate. "The documents are with the prosecutor, and they are moving fast. Grayson and Harlan are already under investigation." Nate nodded, tucking the sparrow back into his pocket, its edges worn from his touch. "Good," he said simply, his gaze returning to Elizabeth. "Let's get you cleaned up, kid. Clara'd have my hide if I let you stay in that state." As they moved toward the infirmary, the fort buzzing with the news of the railroad's downfall, Nate felt a shift within him, subtle but profound. 7 years ago, he'd lost his family to the Blackwells, his heart to grief. Now, in the shadow of Eagle Pass, he'd found a new purpose, not to replace Laura and Emily, but to honor them, to build something new from the ashes. Elizabeth's hand slipped into his, small but strong, and for the first time in years, Nate Caldwell walked toward the future, not away from it. A new dawn, healing at Fort Ellis. Fort Ellis, Montana Territory, April 1876. The midday sun bathed Fort Ellis in a golden glow, its rays glinting off the polished brass buttons of soldiers drilling in the courtyard and the tin roofs of the barracks. Inside the fort's infirmary, a low building with whitewashed walls and the sharp scent of carbolic acid, Nathaniel Nate Caldwell lay on a narrow cot, his arm and thigh bandaged, his weathered face pale but resolute. The wounds from his stand in Eagle Pass, a bullet grazed across his forearm, another on his thigh, had been cleaned and stitched by the fort's surgeon, a gruff Irishman named Dr. O'Malley, who'd muttered about damn fool ranchers, while working with a precision that belied his complaints. Nate's body ached, each breath a reminder of the night's violence, but his mind was clear, anchored by the knowledge that Elizabeth was safe, her documents delivered to Federal Marshal Jeremiah Tate, and the railroad's corrupt empire teetering on the edge of collapse. Across the room, Elizabeth sat on a stool beside Private Ellis's cot, her own shoulder bandaged under a clean cotton dress provided by the fort's quartermaster. Her dark hair was neatly braided, a blue ribbon, Clara Bennett's touch, sent with a care package from Caldwell Ranch, tying it back. She held a tin cup of broth, coaxing Ellis to take small sips, her movements gentle but determined, a mirror of the resilience that had carried her through the massacre and the perilous ride through Eagle Pass. Ellis, pale and weak from blood loss, managed a faint smile, his voice a whisper. "You're a tough one, miss. Most be crying their eyes out after what you've seen." Elizabeth's lips curved, a small, solemn smile that held more strength than sorrow. "Mr. Caldwell didn't let me give up," she said, her voice soft but steady, no longer the raspy whisper of the mountains. "Neither did Jim or you." She glanced at Nate, her eyes meeting his across the infirmary, a silent acknowledgement of the bond forged in blood and fire. Nate nodded, the wooden sparrow still in his coat pocket, its edges worn from his touch, a talisman of the promise he'd kept. The infirmary door swung open, admitting Marshal Jeremiah Tate, his broad frame filling the doorway, his salt-and-pepper beard framing a face etched with the weight of justice. Behind him came Lieutenant Samuel Carter, his youthful features hardened by the events of the past days, and Clara Bennett, her apron swapped for a travel-worn shawl, her sharp blue eyes scanning the room until they landed on Nate and Elizabeth. "Well, don't you two look like you've been through a stampede," Clara said, her tone brisk but laced with relief as she crossed to Nate's cot, a basket of provisions, bandages, biscuits, a jar of her famous chokecherry jam tucked under her arm. Nate managed a wry smile, wincing as he shifted on the cot. "Good to see you too, Clara." "How's the ranch?" Clara set the basket down, her hands on her hips. "Standin', thanks to Sammy and the boys. But I ain't here to talk fence posts. Heard you played cavalry out there, Nate Caldwell, and lived to tell the tale." Her voice softened, a rare crack in her no-nonsense facade. "Lord'd be proud, you know. So would Jim." The mention of Jim Donovan, the foreman who'd given his life in the canyon, brought a shadow to Nate's eyes, but he nodded, accepting the weight of her words. Tate cleared his throat, his presence commanding attention. "Mr. Caldwell, Miss Elizabeth," he began, his voice a low rumble, "I've got news from Helena." The federal prosecutors reviewed the documents, every ledger, every deed, every name. They've issued warrants for Senator Grayson, Judge Harlan, and a dozen others. The Pacific Northern's Western office is under lockdown, and the conspirators are singing like canaries, trying to save their own hides. This is the biggest corruption bust in the territory's history, and it's all because of you two. Elizabeth's hands tightened in her lap, her gaze dropping to the floor, the weight of her role in the upheaval pressing hard. "My brother. The Thorntons. Jim," she said quietly. "They died for those papers." Tate's eyes softened, a fatherly warmth breaking through his stern exterior. "They did, and their deaths weren't in vain. We're naming a new outpost after Donovan Station, at Eagle Pass. And your brother, Benjamin, he'll be honored in the official report. As for the Thorntons, I've got agents tracking down their kin in Pennsylvania to make sure their story's told." Nate's voice was rough, tempered by pain and resolve. "What about Elizabeth? She's still a target, even with the warrants out." Tate nodded, his expression grim. "She's under federal protection, and I'll see to it personally that no one gets near her. But there's more to discuss, her future specifically." He glanced at Elizabeth, then back at Nate, his meaning clear. "She's got no living kin, far as we can tell. Her brother's gone, parents died years ago, and after her testimony there'll be folks holding grudges, even with the conspirators behind bars." Clara's eyes narrowed, catching the drift of Tate's words. "You're talking adoption, ain't you?" she said, her tone sharp but curious. Tate nodded, pulling a leather folder from his coat. "I've had papers drawn up, preliminary, based on what Elizabeth told me about her time at Caldwell Ranch. Judge Anderson in Helena's willing to expedite, given the circumstances, but it's up to you, Mr. Caldwell, and you, Miss Elizabeth." He handed the folder to Nate, who took it with a steadiness that belied the storm of emotions within him. Nate opened the folder, scanning the legal documents, adoption papers, neatly typed, with spaces for his signature and Elizabeth's consent. His heart thudded, a mix of fear and hope, the weight of the decision heavier than any gunfight. 7 years ago, he'd lost Emily, his daughter, to the Blackwell gang, and the guilt had nearly destroyed him. To take on another child, to open that wound, was a risk he'd never imagined facing again. Yet Elizabeth's presence, her stubborn resilience, her trust, had cracked the fortress he'd built around his heart, letting in a light he'd thought extinguished. Elizabeth watched him, her solemn eyes searching his face, as if she could read the battle within him. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, her voice clear now, carrying the strength of a survivor, "do you want me to stay?" "To be your daughter." The word hung in the air, fragile but powerful, a bridge between their shared losses. Nate's throat tightened, Laura's voice echoing in his mind. A man's only as good as the promises he keeps. He looked at Elizabeth, seeing not a replacement for Emily but a girl who'd fought her way through hell, who'd given him a reason to fight again. "I want you to be where you feel safe," he said, his voice rough but honest. "And yeah, I want you here with me. But it's your choice, Elizabeth. Always will be." Her eyes glistened, but her voice was firm, a decision made. "I want to stay. Not because I got nowhere else, but because this is home." She reached for his hand, her small fingers intertwining with his calloused ones, a gesture that needed no words. "I know I ain't Emily," she added, her voice soft but steady. "I won't try to be her. But I want to be Elizabeth Caldwell." The name struck Nate like a bell, clear and resonant, a new beginning built on the foundations of loss. "Elizabeth Caldwell," he repeated, testing the sound, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "That's got a ring to it." Clara made a small, satisfied sound, her eyes suspiciously bright, while Tate nodded, his respect evident. "I'll send word to Judge Anderson," he said, tucking the folder back into his coat. "We'll need a formal hearing, but with my recommendation and Carter's, it's as good as done." Carter, standing by the door, cleared his throat, a rare grin breaking through his professional demeanor. "Told you Caldwell was a stubborn bastard," he said to Tate, earning a sharp look from Clara. "Language, Lieutenant," she snapped, but her tone held a warmth that belied the rebuke. "This is a family matter now." The word family settled over the room, a quiet promise of something new, something worth fighting for. Silver Creek Valley, Montana Territory. The journey back to Caldwell Ranch was delayed by Nate's recovery, the surgeon insisting on a week of rest to ensure his wounds healed properly. Elizabeth stayed at Fort Ellis, under Tate's protection, spending her days helping in the infirmary and writing letters to Clara, detailing her hopes for the ranch, a garden like the one her mother had kept, a library for the children she dreamed of welcoming. The fort buzzed with news of the railroad scandal, the Helena Gazette printing headlines about Senator Grayson's arrest and Judge Harlan's confession, each story a testament to Elizabeth's courage and Nate's sacrifice. When Nate was finally cleared to travel, he and Elizabeth rode back to Silver Creek Valley in a military wagon, escorted by Carter and a small detachment. The valley unfolded before them, its grasslands vibrant with spring's first blooms, the ranch house standing proud against the backdrop of the Bitterroot Mountains. Clara waited on the porch, her arms crossed, a rare smile softening her weathered face as the wagon rolled up. "'Bout time you two showed up," she called, descending the steps to help Elizabeth down. "Ranch ain't the same without you mackin' trouble." Elizabeth laughed, a sound that caught Nate off guard, bright and unguarded, a glimpse of the girl she might have been before the massacre. "I ain't made trouble yet, Miss Clara," she teased, hugging the older woman fiercely. Nate dismounted, his wound still tender but his stride steady, and shook hands with Sammy Holt, now promoted to foreman in Jim's place. "Ranch looks good," he said, his eyes sweeping the fresh paint on the barn, the new corral fence, the bustle of hands at work. Sammy grinned, tipping his hat. Had to keep busy while you were playing hero, boss. Inside, the house had changed, subtle but significant. The portrait of Laura, Emily, and Nate still hung above the fireplace, a touchstone of memory, but it was joined by new additions. A sketch of Jim Donovan standing proud beside his prize stallion. A photograph of the ranch hands, Sammy at the center, grinning like a kid. And a small drawing of Elizabeth, done by a soldier's wife at the fort, capturing her solemn eyes and faint smile. Clara had prepared a feast: roast beef, mashed potatoes, her chokecherry jam spread on fresh biscuits. A welcome home that filled the dining room with warmth and laughter, a stark contrast to the silence that had haunted it for 7 years. After supper, Nate found Elizabeth on the porch swing, staring up at the Montana sky, its stars a glittering canopy above the valley. "Cold out here," he said, draping a quilt over her shoulders before sitting beside her, the swing creaking gently under their weight. "Missed this," she said, her voice soft. Fort Ellis was safe, but the stars weren't the same. "Too many lanterns." Nate nodded, the silence between them comfortable, a shared understanding forged in the crucible of Eagle Pass. "Tate brought the final adoption papers," he said after a moment, his tone careful. "Judge Anderson's reviewed everything, says it's all in order." "But I meant what I said, it's your choice, Elizabeth." She turned to him, her expression serious beyond her years. "I chose already, Mr. Caldwell. This is home and she hesitated, then said, "You're my family now." The word struck Nate deep, a healing balm on wounds he'd thought would never close. "Family," he repeated, the word new but right. "Reckon we'll figure it out together." They sat in companionable silence, the swing's gentle motion a rhythm of hope, the stars above a witness to the extraordinary journey that had brought them here. A massacre that left one survivor, a rancher forced to face his past, and a new beginning built on shared loss and mutual healing. Elizabeth's hand found his, her fingers small but strong, and Nate felt the last piece of his broken heart settle into place, not whole but mended, ready for the future. A home reborn, the legacy of Caldwell Ranch. Silver Creek Valley, Montana Territory, October 1876. Autumn painted Silver Creek Valley in a riot of gold and crimson, the aspen groves shimmering like fire under the crisp October sky. Caldwell Ranch stood at the heart of the valley, its timber and stone house newly adorned with fresh whitewash, the barns bustling with the rhythm of a community reborn. Nathaniel Nate Caldwell stood on the porch, his weathered hands resting on the railing, his steel-gray eyes surveying the changes that had transformed his once solitary domain. The corral held a dozen horses, their coats gleaming in the sunlight, while laughter, bright, unguarded, and unfamiliar, drifted from the new schoolhouse near the creek, where a handful of children chased each other in a game of tag. 6 months had passed since the harrowing events at Eagle Pass, 6 months of healing, justice, and a quiet revolution that had reshaped Nate's life and the ranch he'd built. The wounds from his stand against the railroad's mercenaries. A bullet graze on his forearm, another on his thigh, had healed into faint scars, a physical echo of the deeper transformation within him. Elizabeth, the girl who'd arrived as a traumatized fugitive, was now Elizabeth Caldwell, her adoption finalized in a Helena courtroom under the stern but fair gaze of Judge Anderson. The legal papers, signed in ink and sealed with a federal stamp, rested in Nate's study, a testament to a bond forged in fire and blood. The ranch itself had evolved, its purpose expanding beyond cattle and crops to become the Caldwell home for children, a sanctuary for orphans of the frontier. Elizabeth's vision, born in the letters she'd written from Fort Ellis during the trial, had taken root with a passion that surprised even Nate. The eastern pastures had been sold to fund the construction of a dormitory and schoolhouse, their cedar walls and slate roofs a stark contrast to the rugged barns. 5 children, 3 boys and 2 girls, their ages ranging from 7 to 14, had already taken up residence, their laughter and squabbles filling the house with a life Nate had thought lost forever. A young teacher from Bozeman, Miss Abigail Harper, presided over the schoolhouse, her gentle firmness a perfect match for the children's needs. Nate's gaze drifted to the hillside beyond the creek, where a simple stone marker stood, etched with Jim Donovan's name. The foreman's body had been recovered from the canyon, his sacrifice honored with a quiet burial overlooking the valley he'd loved. The outpost at Eagle Pass, now called Donovan Station, stood as a permanent tribute, its watchtower guarding the trail against the outlaws and deserters who'd once used it as a haven. Nate visited the marker often, speaking to Jim in the silence of his heart, promising to carry forward the legacy of courage that had saved Elizabeth and exposed the railroad's corruption. Inside the house, Clara Bennett was a whirlwind of activity, her apron dusted with flour as she prepared for the evening's harvest festival, a community gathering to celebrate the ranch's new purpose. The dining room table groaned under the weight of her handiwork: roast venison, mashed potatoes with gravy, cornbread studded with kernels, and a towering apple pie that could tempt a saint. "You plannin' to stand there all day, Nate Caldwell, or you gonna help me wrangle these young'uns?" Clara called from the doorway, her sharp blue eyes twinkling with mischief. "Festival starts at sundown, and I ain't doin' all the heavy liftin'." Nate chuckled, a sound that still felt foreign but increasingly natural. "Reckon I can manage a few chores, Clara." "Where's Elizabeth?" Clara jerked her thumb toward the schoolhouse. "Out there, teachin' the little ones how to read a map. Girls got a head for learnin' and a heart for sharin' it." Nate nodded, pride swelling in his chest, and headed toward the schoolhouse, his boots crunching on the gravel path. The valley was alive with preparation, ranch hands stringing lanterns between the barns, women from Promise Creek setting up tables laden with quilts and preserves, children darting about with homemade kites, their laughter a melody against the lowing of cattle. Elizabeth stood in the schoolhouse yard, a map of Montana territory spread on a wooden table, her finger tracing the route from Silver Creek Valley to Helena as 4 children listened, rapt. Her dark hair was pulled back with a ribbon, her dress a practical calico that suited her new role as both student and mentor. At 13, she carried herself with a quiet confidence, the trauma of the Wagon train massacre still a shadow in her eyes, but no longer the defining force of her life. "This here's Eagle Pass," she said, her voice clear and steady, "where Mr. Caldwell and Mr. Donovan fought to keep folks safe. You gotta know your land if you're gonna call it home." One of the boys, a 7-year-old named Tommy Weber with a mop of red hair, raised his hand. "Did Mr. Caldwell really shoot 10 outlaws by himself?" Elizabeth's lips twitched, a smile breaking through her solemn demeanor. "Not 10, Tommy, but he held his own. He's the bravest man I know, but he don't like braggin'." The children giggled, and Nate, standing just out of sight, felt a warmth he hadn't known in years, a sense of belonging that had been buried with Laura and Emily. He stepped forward, clearing his throat. "Don't go filling their heads with tall tales, Elizabeth," he said, his tone mock stern but his eyes soft. She turned, her smile widening, and ran to him, wrapping her arms around his waist in a hug that no longer caught him off guard. "They need to know the truth," she said, pulling back to look up at him. "You're a hero, Pa." The word, Pa, struck Nate like a sunrise, bright and unexpected, a title he'd never thought to hear again. He ruffled her hair, his voice rough with emotion. "Reckon I'm just a rancher trying to do right by you, kid." The festival began as the sun dipped below the Bitterroot Mountains, the valley aglow with lantern light and alive with the hum of community. Sheriff Amos Harper arrived with his deputy, Caleb Monroe, their badges gleaming as they swapped stories with the ranch hands over mugs of cider. Miss Harper led the children in a round of folk songs, her clear soprano rising above the crackle of the bonfire, while Clara and the Promise Creek women served plates piled high with food, their laughter mingling with the clink of tin cups. Elizabeth moved among the crowd, helping the younger children with their kites, her presence a quiet anchor in the festive chaos. Nate stood by the bonfire, a tin mug in hand, watching the scene unfold. The ranch was no longer just his. It was a home, a haven, a legacy that stretched beyond his own pain. A letter from Marshal Jeremiah Tate, delivered that morning, rested in his pocket, its contents a final seal on the past 6 months. All 9 surviving conspirators convicted, Grayson, Harlan, and the rest. Federal sentences, no parole. Elizabeth's testimony was the linchpin. The territory owes you both. The words were a vindication, but Nate's true reward was here, in the laughter of children, the warmth of Clara's cooking, the trust in Elizabeth's eyes. Clara joined him, her shawl wrapped tight against the evening chill. "Never thought I'd see the day when Caldwell Ranch was the heart of the valley," she said, her voice soft but proud. "You've done good, Nate. Better than good." He shook his head, his gaze on Elizabeth, who was now teaching Tommy how to skip stones by the creek. "Wasn't my idea, Clara. It was hers. She saw what this place could be, even when I was too blind to look." Clara's eyes followed his, her expression thoughtful. "She's got Laura's heart, you know, kind but fierce. And Emily's spirit, stubborn as a mule." Nate's throat tightened, but for the first time, the mention of his lost family didn't cut like a blade. "Yeah," he said quietly. "But she's Elizabeth too. Her own person, Mac in her own way." Clara nodded, a rare tear glinting in her eye. "And you're her pa, Nate. Don't you forget it." As the festival wound down, the children gathered around the bonfire for stories, Miss Harper spinning tales of frontier heroes and Montana's wild past. Elizabeth sat beside Nate, her head resting against his shoulder, the quilt from the porch swing draped over them both. "Tell him about Eagle Pass," she whispered, her voice sleepy but insistent. Nate hesitated, then began, his deep voice carrying over the crackle of the flames. "Wasn't just me out there," he said, his eyes on the stars. "It was Jim Donovan, fight into his last breath. It was Elizabeth, ridden through hell to get the truth out. And it was all of us, holding on to what's right no matter the cost." The children listened, wide-eyed, as Nate wove the tale, not of a lone hero but of a community, a family, forged in the crucible of loss and courage. Elizabeth's hand found his, her fingers small but strong, and Nate felt the weight of his past settle into something new, a foundation, not a chain. The stars above Silver Creek Valley shone bright, witnesses to a journey that had begun with a massacre and ended with a home, a legacy that would endure long after the fire's embers faded. Epilogue, a year later, October 1877. The Harvest Festival of 1877 was grander than the last, Silver Creek Valley alive with the clamor of a growing community. Caldwell Ranch had become a beacon, its children's home now housing 10 orphans, their voices a constant hum of life. The schoolhouse had expanded, a second teacher joining Miss Harper, and a small library, Elizabeth's pride, stood beside it, stocked with books donated by Bozeman and Helena families. Elizabeth, now 14, was a leader among the children, her quiet wisdom and fierce heart earning her the nickname Miss Lizzie, though she still called Nate Pa with a smile that lit the valley. Nate stood on the porch, a letter from Marshal Tate in hand, its contents a quiet victory. The railroad case is closed, all appeals denied. Donovan Station's a model outpost, and the territory's cleaner for it. You and Elizabeth changed Montana, Caldwell. Beside him, Elizabeth read the letter, her eyes bright with pride but tempered by memory. They can't hurt anyone now, she said, her voice steady. Benjamin, the Thorntons, Jim, they'd be glad. Nate nodded, his hand resting on her shoulder, the wooden sparrow still in his pocket, a relic of their shared journey. The festival unfolded below, lanterns glowing, fiddles playing, children dancing under the autumn sky. Clara, now officially the home's matron, presided over the feast, her chokecherry jam a legend among the valley's folk. Sheriff Amos Harper swapped tales with Lieutenant Carter, who'd been promoted for his role in the railroad bust, while Sammy Holt, the new foreman, organized a horse race that had the children cheering. Nate watched it all, a man no longer defined by grief but by purpose, a father again, not in place of Emily but alongside her memory. Elizabeth leaned against him, her voice soft. "This is what home feels like, ain't it, Pa?" Nate's smile was slow, warm, a reflection of the man he'd become. "Yeah, Lizzie. This is home." Under the vast Montana sky, the Caldwell home for children stood as a testament to loss and love, a legacy built on the courage of a girl who'd survived a massacre and the rancher who'd found his heart again, together forging a future as enduring as the mountains themselves. Legacy under the stars, the future of Caldwell Ranch. Silver Creek Valley, Montana Territory, October 1878. The autumn of 1878 draped Silver Creek Valley in a tapestry of amber and scarlet, the rolling grasslands and aspen groves glowing under a sky so vast it seemed to hold the weight of eternity. Caldwell Ranch stood as a beacon at the valley's heart, its sturdy timber house and sprawling barns no longer just a testament to Nate Caldwell's stubborn perseverance, but a living symbol of hope, resilience, and community. The air carried the crisp bite of fall, mingled with the scent of wood smoke and fresh-turned earth, as the valley prepared for its third annual harvest festival, a celebration that had grown from a modest gathering into a cornerstone of Montana's frontier spirit. Nathaniel Nate Caldwell leaned against the porch railing, his calloused hands wrapped around a tin mug of Clara Bennett's black as tar coffee, his steel-gray eyes tracing the bustling scene below. At 49, the lines on his face told a story of harsh winters, unrelenting summers, and a grief that had once threatened to consume him. But now, those lines were softened by purpose, by the laughter of children echoing from the schoolhouse, by the steady presence of Elizabeth Caldwell, the girl who'd arrived as a traumatized fugitive and become his daughter, his reason to rebuild. The scars on his arm and thigh, souvenirs of his stand at Eagle Pass 2 years prior, ached in the morning chill, but they were a quiet reminder of the fight that had changed everything. The Caldwell home for children had flourished beyond Nate's wildest hopes, its dormitory now housing 12 orphans, their ages spanning 6 to 16, each one a thread in the valley's growing tapestry. The schoolhouse, expanded with a second classroom and a library stocked with books from as far as Chicago, was a hive of learning, presided over by Miss Abigail Harper and her assistant, a young widow named Sarah Linden. Elizabeth, at 15, was both student and mentor, her quiet wisdom and fierce heart earning her the affection of the children and the respect of the adults. The ranch itself remained a working operation, cattle grazing in the western pastures, hay stacked high in the barns, but its soul had shifted, becoming a sanctuary where the lost found home. Clara emerged from the house, her apron dusted with flour, a tray of her legendary chokecherry jam biscuits balanced in her hands. "You gonna stand there moonin' all day, Nate Caldwell, or you gonna help me set up for the festival?" she asked, her sharp blue eyes glinting with the mix of sass and warmth that had kept the ranch running for 9 years. Nate took a sip of coffee, his lips twitching in a rare smile. Reckon I can spare a hand, Clara. Where's Lizzie? Clara nodded toward the creek, where Elizabeth was organizing a group of children in a kite-making workshop, their voices rising in a chorus of excitement. Out there playing teacher again. Girls got more energy than a spring colt. Nate followed her gaze, pride swelling in his chest as he watched Elizabeth demonstrate how to tie a kite string, her dark hair catching the sunlight, her laughter a melody that had become the ranch's heartbeat. The adoption, finalized in the spring of 1876, had been more than a legal act. It was a covenant, a promise to build a future together, not to erase the past but to honor it. Elizabeth's testimony in Helena, delivered with a courage that had silenced the courtroom, had brought down Senator Grayson, Judge Harlan, and their corrupt network, earning her a place in Montana's history. But it was here, in the daily rhythms of the ranch, that she'd found her true calling, shaping a home for others as she'd once needed herself. The festival preparations were in full swing, the valley alive with the hum of community. Ranch hands strung lanterns between the barns, their rough laughter mingling with the clatter of hammers as they set up tables for the feast. Women from Promise Creek arrived in wagons, their arms laden with quilts, preserves, and baskets of cornbread, while a fiddler from Bozeman tuned his instrument, the first notes of a reel floating on the breeze. Sheriff Amos Harper, his badge polished to a shine, swapped stories with Lieutenant Samuel Carter, now a captain, his promotion a reward for his role in the railroad bust. Sammy Holt, the young foreman who'd stepped into Jim Donovan's boots, organized a horse race that had the children cheering, their homemade kites soaring above the grasslands. Nate joined the effort, helping Sammy haul a barrel of cider to the main table, his wounds no longer a hindrance but a badge of survival. A new addition to the ranch caught his eye, a trading post near the schoolhouse, its shelves stocked with goods from a Shoshone trader named Running Elk, who'd become a regular visitor. Running Elk's presence, his quiet wisdom and intricate beadwork, had enriched the valley, bridging the divide between settlers and the native peoples who'd called this land home for centuries. Elizabeth had struck up a friendship with his daughter, Little Star, their shared love of stories, a bond that transcended their different worlds. As the sun dipped toward the Bitterroot Mountains, casting a warm glow over the valley, the festival began in earnest. The bonfire roared to life, its flames dancing against the twilight, while the fiddler's reel drew couples to an impromptu dance floor marked by hay bales. Clara presided over the feast, her apple pie and chokecherry jam biscuits drawing gasps of delight, her matronly authority ensuring no child went without a second helping. Elizabeth moved through the crowd, her calico dress bright against the firelight, helping the younger children with their plates, her laughter mingling with theirs. Nate watched from the sidelines, a tin mug of cider in hand, the weight of the past 2 years settling into a quiet peace. A letter from Marshal Jeremiah Tate, received the previous week, rested in Nate's study, its contents a final chapter in the railroad saga, the last of the conspirators sentenced, no appeals granted. Donovan Station's a model for frontier security, and the Caldwell home is the talk of Helena. You and Elizabeth are legends, my friend. The words were a vindication, but Nate's true legacy was here, in the children's laughter, the community's strength, the daughter who'd brought him back to life. A memory surfaced, soft but vivid. Laura, sitting on this very porch, her voice warm as she read to Emily under the stars. A man's only as good as the promises he keeps, she'd said, and Nate had kept his, to Elizabeth, to Jim, to himself. Clara joined him, her shawl wrapped tight against the evening chill. Val has changed since that girl showed up, she said, her voice soft but proud. You've changed, Nate. Ain't the same man who used to eat alone in his study. Nate's gaze drifted to Elizabeth, now leading a group of children in a round of "Oh, Susanna," her voice clear and bright. "Wasn't my doing, Clara." Lizzie saw what this place could be, even when I was too stubborn to look. Clara's eyes glistened, her practicality giving way to sentiment. "She's got Laura's heart, Emily's fire, and her own kind of courage. And you, Nate, you're her pa through and through." Before Nate could respond, Elizabeth bounded up the steps, her cheeks flushed from the cold and the joy of the evening. "Pa, you gotta tell a story by the fire," she said, her eyes sparkling. "The kids are asking for Eagle Pass again." Nate chuckled, setting down his mug. "Reckon I can manage that, but only if you help." She grinned, grabbing his hand and pulling him toward the bonfire, where the children had gathered, their faces lit by the flames, their kites now tucked away for the night. Nate settled onto a hay bale, Elizabeth beside him, the quilt from the porch swing draped over their shoulders. The crowd hushed, the fiddler pausing his tune, as Nate's deep voice rose above the crackle of the fire. "This ain't just a story about me," he began, his eyes on the stars. "It's about a girl who survived the worst the world could throw at her, about a man who gave his life to protect her, about a community that stood together when the odds were stacked against M. It's about Eagle Pass, but it's also about this valley, this home we've built." He wove the tale with care, not as a hero's saga but as a testament to courage. Elizabeth's ride through the mountains, Jim Donovan's sacrifice, the ranch hand's quiet bravery, Clara's steadfast heart. The children listened, wide-eyed, while the adults nodded, their faces reflecting the pride of a valley reborn. Elizabeth added her own voice, describing the moment Nate found her on the ridge, his shout cutting through her fear, a beacon in the darkness. "He kept his promise," she said, her voice steady, "and that's why we're all here." As the story ended, the crowd erupted in applause, the children clamoring for another, but Nate raised a hand, his smile warm but firm. "That's enough for tonight, young uns. Time to let the stars tell their own tales." The festival continued, the fiddler striking up a new reel, the dance floor filling with couples young and old. Elizabeth leaned against Nate, her head on his shoulder, the quilt a shared shield against the night's chill. "This is what I wanted," she whispered, her voice soft but certain. "A place where no one's alone." Nate's throat tightened, the weight of her words settling deep. "You made it happen, Lizzie," he said, his voice rough with pride. "This is your legacy as much as mine." She looked up at him, her eyes reflecting the firelight, and nodded, a silent agreement that their journey, though born in pain, had led to something enduring. The wooden sparrow, still in his pocket, was a quiet reminder of the night she'd pressed it into his hand, a vow that had bound them through the storm and into this new dawn. Epilogue, a decade later, October 1888. 10 years had passed since the Harvest Festival of 1878, and Silver Creek Valley had grown into a thriving hub of Montana's frontier, its grasslands dotted with new homesteads, its trails bustling with traders and settlers. Caldwell Ranch remained the valley's heart, its children's home now a beacon for the territory, housing 20 orphans under the care of Miss Abigail Harper and a team of teachers and caregivers. The schoolhouse had become a proper academy, its library one of the finest in Montana, thanks to Elizabeth's tireless fundraising and donations from Helena's elite. Elizabeth Caldwell, now 25, stood at the forefront of the home's mission, her quiet wisdom and fierce compassion shaping a generation of children. She'd studied in Bozeman, earning a teaching certificate, but returned to the ranch, her heart tied to the valley and the family she'd found. Her dark hair, still braided with a ribbon, framed a face marked by both strength and kindness, the scars of her past a quiet undercurrent to her vibrant life. She was engaged to a young lawyer from Helena, a man who shared her passion for justice, their wedding planned for the spring, a celebration the valley was already buzzing about. Nate, at 59, was a patriarch in every sense, his once gray hair now fully silver, his face a map of a life well lived. The ranch's cattle operations thrived under Sammy Holt's leadership, but Nate's true work was with the children, teaching them to ride, to track, to love the land as he did. The scars from Eagle Pass were faint now, overshadowed by the warmth of a home filled with laughter and purpose. Clara, though slowed by age, remained the home's matron, her chokecherry jam a legend that drew visitors from as far as Bozeman. She and Nate shared a quiet bond, two survivors who'd built something extraordinary from the ashes of their losses. The Harvest Festival of 1888 was the grandest yet, the valley aglow with lanterns and alive with music, the bonfire a beacon that drew hundreds from Promise Creek and beyond. Running Elk and Little Star attended, their beadwork stall a festival highlight, their presence a reminder of the valley's inclusive spirit. Sheriff Amos Harper, now retired, swapped tales with Captain Samuel Carter, whose outpost at Donovan Station had become a model for frontier security. Marshal Jeremiah Tate sent a letter, read aloud by Elizabeth to the gathered crowd. The Caldwell home is Montana's pride, a testament to courage and compassion. You've changed the territory, and your legacy will endure. As the festival wound down, Nate and Elizabeth stood on the hillside by Jim Donovan's marker. The valley spread below them like a painting, its lights twinkling under the vast Montana sky. 10 years, Elizabeth said, her voice soft but resonant. Feels like a lifetime, don't it, Pa? Nate nodded, his hand resting on her shoulder, the wooden sparrow still in his pocket, its edges worn smooth by time. Feels like yesterday, too, he said, his voice rough with memory. You were a scared kid with a satchel full of trouble, and I was a fool thinking I could stay alone forever. Elizabeth laughed, the sound bright and free, a far cry from the silent girl who'd arrived in a storm. You ain't alone anymore, Pa. None of us are. She gestured to the festival below where children danced, adults shared stories, and the valley pulsed with life. This is what Benjamin wanted, what the Thorntons died for, what Jim fought for. A home, a future. Nate's throat tightened, Laura's words echoing in his heart. A man's only as good as the promises he keeps. He'd kept his, to Elizabeth, to the children, to the valley, and in doing so had found a legacy worth leaving. They stood in silence, the stars above witnesses to a journey that had begun with a massacre and ended with a family, a community, a home that would stand as long as the mountains endured. Elizabeth's hand found his, her fingers strong and sure, and Nate felt the weight of his past transform into a foundation for the future, a promise kept under the endless Montana sky.